research. And now came on, as come it must, what Hans Castorp had never thought to experience: the winter of the place, the winter of these high altitudes. Joachim knew it already. It had been in full blast when he arrived the year before, but Hans Castorp rather dreaded it, however well he felt himself equipped. Joachim sought to reassure him. "You must not imagine it grimmer than it is," he said. "Not really Arctic. You will feel the cold less on account of the dryness of the air and the absence of wind. It's the thing about the change of temperature above the fog line. They found out lately that it gets warmer in the upper reaches, something they did not know before. I should say it is actually colder when it rains. But you have your sleeping bag, and they turn on the heat when they absolutely must." And in fact, there could be no talk of violence or surprises. The winter came mildly on, at first no different from many a day they had seen in the height of summer. The wind had been 2 days in the south. The sun bore down. The valleys seemed shrunken. The side walls at its mouth looked near and bald. Clouds came up behind Pismichel and Tinsenhorn and drove northeastwards. It rained heavily. Then the rain turned foul, a whitish gray, mingled with snowflakes. Soon it was all snow. The valley was full of flurry. It kept on and on. The temperature fell appreciably, so that the fallen snow could not quite melt, but lay covering the valley with a wet and threadbare white garment, against which showed black the pines on the slopes. In the dining room the radiators were lukewarm. That was at the beginning of November, All Souls, and there was no novelty about it. In August it had been even so. They had long left off regarding snow as a prerogative of winter. White traces lingered after every storm in the crannies of the rocky Ratican, the chain that seemed to guard the end of the valley, and the distant monarchs to the south were always in snow. But the storm and the fall in the temperature both continued. A pale gray sky hung low over the valley. It seemed to dissolve in flakes and fall soundlessly and ceaselessly until one almost felt uneasy. It turned colder by the hour. A morning came when the thermometer in Hans Castorp's room registered 44 degrees. The next morning it was only 40 degrees. That was cold. It kept within bounds, but it persisted. It had frozen at night. Now it froze in the daytime as well, and all day long, and it snowed, with brief intervals, through the 4th, the 5th, and the 7th days. The snow mounted apace. It became a nuisance. Paths had been shoveled as far as the bench by the watercourse and on the drive down to the valley, but these were so narrow that you could only walk single file, and if you met anyone, you must step off the pavement and at once sink knee-deep in snow. A stone roller drawn by a horse, with a man at his halter, rolled all day long up and down the streets of the Cure, while a yellow diligence on runners, looking like an old-fashioned post-coach, plied between village and Cure, with a snowplough attached in front, shoveling the white masses aside. The world, this narrow, lofty, isolated world up here, looked now well wadded and upholstered indeed. No pillar or post but wore its white cap. The steps up to the entrance of the Berghof had turned into an inclined plane. Heavy cushions, in the drollest shapes, weighed down the branches of the Scotch firs. Now and then one slid off and raised up a cloud of powdery white dust in its fall. Round about, the heights lay smothered in snow, their lower regions rugged with the evergreen growth, their upper parts, beyond the timberline, softly covered up to their many-shaped summits. The air was dark, the sun but a pallid apparition behind a veil. Yet a mild reflected brightness came from the snow, a milky gleam whose light became both landscape and human beings, even though these latter did show red noses under their white or gaily colored woolen caps. In the dining room the onset of winter, the season of the region, was the subject of conversation at all 7 tables. Many tourists and sportsmen were said to have arrived and taken up residence at the hotels in the Dorf and the Platz. The height of the piled-up snow was estimated at 2 feet. Its consistency was said to be ideal for skiing. The bob run, which led down from the northwestern slope of the Swiss Alps into the valley, was zealously worked on. It would be possible to open it in the next few days, unless a thaw put out all calculations. Everyone looked forward eagerly to the activities of these sound people down below, to the sports and races, which it was forbidden to attend, but which numbers of the patients resolved to see, by cutting the rest cure and slipping out of the Berghof. Hans Castorp heard of a new sport that had come from Scandinavia, skijoring. It consisted in races in which the participants were drawn by horses while standing in their skis. It was to see this that so many of the patients had resolved to slip out. There was talk too of Christmas. Christmas. Hans Castorp had never once thought of it. To be sure, he had blithely said and written that he must spend the winter up here with Joachim because of what the doctors had discovered to be the state of his health. But now he was startled to realize that Christmas would be included in the program, perhaps because, and yet not entirely because, he had never spent the Christmas season anywhere but in the bosom of the family. Well, if he must, he would have to put up with it. He was no longer a child. Joachim seemed not to mind, or else to have adjusted himself uncomplainingly to the prospect. And after all, he said to himself, think of all the places and all the conditions in which Christmas has been celebrated before now. Yet it did seem to him rather premature to begin thinking about Christmas even before the Advent season, 6 weeks at least before the holiday. True, such an interval was easily overleaped by the guests in the dining hall. It was a mental process in which Hans Castorp had already some facility, though he had not yet learned to practice it in the grand style, as the older inhabitants did. Christmas, like other holidays in the course of a year, served them for a fulcrum, or a vaulting pole, with which to leap over empty intervening spaces. They all had fever, their metabolism was accelerated, their bodily processes accentuated, keyed up. All this perhaps accounted for the wholesale way they could put time behind them. It would not have greatly surprised him to hear them discount the Christmas holiday as well, and go on at once to speak of the New Year and Carnival. But no, so capricious and unstable as this they were not, in the Berghof dining room. Christmas gave them pause. It gave them even matter for concern and brain-racking. It was customary to present Hofrat barons with a gift on Christmas Eve, for which a collection was taken up among the guests, and this gift was the subject of much deliberation. A meeting was called. Last year, so the old inhabitants said, they had given him a traveling trunk. This time a new operating table had been considered, an easel, a fur coat, a rocking chair, an inlaid ivory stethoscope. Settembrini, asked for suggestions, proposed that they give the Hofrat a newly projected encyclopedic work called The Sociology of Suffering, but he found only one person to agree with him, a book dealer who sat at Hermine Kleefeld's table. In short, no decision had been reached. There was difficulty about coming to an agreement with the Russian guests. A divergence of views arose. The Muscovites declared their preference for making an independent gift. Frau Stohr went about for days quite outraged on account of a loan of 10 francs, which she inadvisedly laid out for Frau Iltis at the meeting, and which the latter had forgotten to return. She forgot it. The shades of meaning Frau Stohr contrived to convey in this word were many and varied, but one and all expressive of an entire disbelief in Frau Iltis's lack of memory, which, it appeared, had been proof against the hints and proddings Frau Stohr freely admitted having administered. Several times she declared she would resign herself, make Frau Iltis a present of the sum. "I'll pay for both of us," she said. "Then my skirts will be cleared." But in the end she hit upon another plan and communicated it to her tablemates. To their great delight, she had the management refund her the 10 francs and insert it in Frau Iltis's weekly bill. Thus was the reluctant debtor outwitted, and at least this phase of the matter settled. It had stopped snowing. The sky began to clear. The blue-gray cloud masses parted to admit glimpses of the sun, whose rays gave a bluish cast to the scene. Then it grew altogether fair. A bright hard frost and settled winter splendor reigned in the middle of November. The arch of the loggia framed a glorious panorama of snow-powdered forest, softly filled passes and ravines, white, sunlit valleys, and radiant blue heavens above all. In the evening, when the almost full moon appeared, the world lay in enchanted splendor, marvelous. Crystal and diamond it glittered far and wide. The forest stood up very black and white. The quarter of the heavens where the moon was not showed deeply dark, embroidered with stars. On the flashing surface of the snow, shadows, so strong, so sharp and clearly outlined that they seemed almost more real than the objects themselves, fell from houses, trees, and telegraph poles. An hour or so after sunset there would be some 14 degrees of frost. The world seemed spellbound in icy purity, its earthly blemishes veiled. It lay fixed in a deathlike, enchanted trance. Hans Castorp stopped until far into the night in his balcony above the ensorcelled winter scene, much longer than Joachim, who retired at 10 or a little later. His excellent chair, with the sectional mattress and the neck roll, he pulled close to the snow-cushioned balustrade. At his hand was the white table with the lighted reading lamp, a stack of books, and a glass of creamy milk, the evening milk, which was brought to each of the guests' rooms at 9 o'clock. Hans Castorp put a dash of cognac in his, to make it more palatable. Already he had availed himself of all his means of protection against the cold. The entire outfit lay ensconced well up to his chest in the buttoned-up sleeping sack he had acquired in one of the well-furnished shops in the Platz, with the 2 camel's hair rugs folded over it in accordance with the ritual. He wore his winter suit, with a short fur jacket atop, a woolen cap, felt boots, and heavily lined gloves, which, however, could not prevent the stiffening of his fingers. What held him so late, often until midnight and beyond, long after the bad Russian pair had left their loge, was partly the magic of the winter night, into which, until 11, were woven the mounting strains of music from near and far. But even more it was inertia and excitement, both of these at once, and in combination. Bodily inertia, the physical fatigue which hated any idea of moving, and mental excitement, the busy preoccupation of his thoughts with certain new and fascinating studies upon which the young man had embarked, and which left his brain no rest. The weather affected him, his organism was stimulated by the cold. He ate enormously, attacking the mighty Berghof meals, where the roast goose followed upon the roast beef, with the usual Berghof appetite, which was always even larger in winter than in summer. At the same time he had a perpetual craving for sleep. In the daytime, as well as on the moonlit evenings, he would drop off over his books, and then, after a few minutes' unconsciousness, betake himself again to research. Talk fatigued him. He was more inclined than had been his habit to rapid, unrestrained, even reckless speech, but if he talked with Joachim, as they went on their snowy walks, he was liable to be overtaken by giddiness and trembling, would feel dazed and tipsy, and the blood would mount to his head. His curve had gone up since the oncoming of winter, and Hofrat barons had let fall something about injections. These were usually given in cases of obstinate high temperature, and Joachim and at least 2/3 of the guests had them. But he himself felt sure that the increase in his bodily heat had to do with the mental activity and excitation which kept him in his chair on the balcony until deep into the glittering, frosty night. The reading which held him so late suggested such an explanation to his mind. No little reading was done in the rest halls and private loggias of the International Sanatorium Berghof, largely, however, by the newcomers and short-timers, for the patients of many months or years' standing had long learned to kill time without mental effort or means of distraction, by dint of a certain inner virtuosity they came to possess. They even considered it beginner's awkwardness to glue yourself to a book. It was enough to have one lying in your lap or on your little table, in case of need. The collection of the establishment was an amplification of the literature found in a dentist's waiting room, in many languages, profusely illustrated, and offered free of charge. The guests exchanged volumes from the lone library down in the Platz. Now and again there would be a book for which everybody scrambled, even the condescending old inhabitants reaching out their hands with ill-concealed eagerness. At the moment it was a cheap paper-backed volume, introduced by Herr Albin, and entitled The Art of Seduction, a very literal translation from the French, preserving even the syntax of that language, and thus gaining in elegance and pungency of presentation. In matter, it was an exposition of the philosophy of sensual passion, developed in a spirit of debonair and man-of-the-worldly paganism. Frau Storr had read it early, and pronounced it simply ravishing. Frau Magnus, the same who had lost her albumin tolerance, agreed unreservedly. Her husband the brewer purported to have profited personally by a perusal, but regretted that his wife should have taken up that sort of thing, because such reading spoiled the women and gave them immodest ideas. His remarks not a little increased the circulation of the volume. 2 ladies of the lower rest hall, Frau Riedisch, the wife of a Polish industrial magnate, and Frau Hessenfeld, a widow from Berlin. Both of these new arrivals since October claimed the book at the same time, and a regrettable incident arose after dinner. Yes, more than regrettable, for there was a violent scene, overheard by Hans Castorp in his loggia above. It ended in spasms of hysteria on the part of one of the women. It might have been Frau Riedisch, but equally well it might have been Frau Hessenfeld, and she was borne away beside herself to her own room. The youth of the place had got hold of the treatise before those of riper years, studying it in part in groups, after supper, in their various rooms. Hans Castorp himself saw the youth with the fingernail handed to Franchen Oberdank in the dining room. She was a new arrival and a light case, a flaxen-haired young thing whose mother had just brought her to the sanatorium. There may have been exceptions. There may have been those who employed the hours of the rest cure with some serious intellectual occupation, some conceivably profitable study, either by way of keeping in touch with life in the lowlands, or in order to give weight and depth to the passing hour, that it might not be pure time and nothing else besides. Perhaps here, and there was one not, of course, to mention Herr Settembrini, with his zeal for eliminating human suffering, or Joachim with his Russian primer. Yes, there might be one or two thus occupied, if not among the guests in the dining room, which seemed not very likely, then among the bedridden and moribund. Hans Castorp inclined to believe it. He himself, after imbibing all that ocean steamships had to offer him, had ordered certain books from home, some of them bearing on his profession, and they had arrived with his winter clothing, scientific engineering, technique of shipbuilding, and the like. But these volumes lay now neglected in favor of other textbooks belonging to quite a different field, an interest in which had seized upon the young man: anatomy, physiology, biology, works in German, French, and English, sent up to the Berghof by the book dealer in the village, obviously because Hans Castorp had ordered them, as was indeed the case. He had done so of his own motion, without telling anyone. On a solitary walk he took down to the Platz while Joachim was occupied with the weekly weighing or injection. His cousin was surprised when he saw the books in Hans Castorp's hands. They were expensive, as scientific works always are. The prices were marked on the wrappers and inside the front covers. Joachim asked why, if his cousin wanted to read such books, he had not borrowed them of the Hofrat, who surely possessed a well-chosen stock. The young man answered that it was quite a different thing to read when the book was one's own. For his part, he loved to mark them and underline passages in pencil. Joachim could hear, hours on end, the noise made by the paper knife going through the uncut leaves. The volumes were heavy, unhandy. Hans Castorp propped them against his chest or stomach as he lay. They were heavy, but he did not mind. Lying there, his mouth half open, he let his eye glide down the learned page, upon which fell the light from his red-shaded lamp, though he might have read, if need were, by the brilliance of the moonlight alone. He read, following the lines down the page with his head, until at the bottom his chin lay sunk upon his breast, and in this position the reader would pause perhaps for reflection, dozing a little or musing in half-slumber, before lifting his eyes to the next page. He probed profoundly. While the moon took its appointed way above the crystalline splendors of the mountain valley, he read of organized matter, of the properties of protoplasm, that sensitive substance maintaining itself in extraordinary fluctuation between building up and breaking down, of form developing out of rudimentary, but always present, primordia, read with compelling interest of life, and its sacred, impure mysteries. What was life? No one knew. It was undoubtedly aware of itself so soon as it was life, but it did not know what it was. Consciousness, as exhibited by susceptibility to stimulus, was undoubtedly, to a certain degree, present in the lowest, most undeveloped stages of life. It was impossible to fix the first appearance of conscious processes at any point in the history of the individual or the race. Impossible to make consciousness contingent upon, say, the presence of a nervous system. The lowest animal forms had no nervous systems, still less a cerebrum, yet no one would venture to deny them the capacity for responding to stimuli. One could suspend life, not merely particular sense organs, not only nervous reactions, but life itself. One could temporarily suspend the irritability to sensation of every form of living matter in the plant as well as in the animal kingdom. One could narcotize ova and spermatozoa with chloroform, chloral hydrate, or morphine. Consciousness, then, was simply a function of matter organized into life, a function that in higher manifestations turned upon its avatar and became an effort to explore and explain the phenomenon it displayed, a hopeful, hopeless project of life to achieve self-knowledge, nature in recoil, and vainly, in the event, since she cannot be resolved in knowledge. Nor life, when all is said, listen to itself. What was life? No one knew. No one knew the actual point whence it sprang, where it kindled itself. Nothing in the domain of life seemed uncausated, or insufficiently causated, from that point on, but life itself seemed without antecedent. If there was anything that might be said about it, it was this: it must be so highly developed, structurally, that nothing even distantly related to it was present in the inorganic world. Between the protean amoeba and the vertebrate, the difference was slight, unessential, as compared to that between the simplest living organism and that nature which did not even deserve to be called dead, because it was inorganic. For death was only the logical negation of life, but between life and inanimate nature yawned a gulf which research strove in vain to bridge. They tried to close it with hypotheses, which it swallowed down without becoming any the less deep or broad. Seeking for a connecting link, they had condescended to the preposterous assumption of structureless living matter, unorganized organisms, which darted together of themselves in the albumin solution, like crystals in the mother liquor, yet organic differentiation still remained at once condition and expression of all life. One could point to no form of life that did not owe its existence to procreation by parents. They had fished the primeval slime out of the depth of the sea, and great had been the jubilation, but the end of it all had been shame and confusion. For it turned out that they had mistaken a precipitate of sulfate of lime for protoplasm. But then, to avoid giving pause before a miracle, for life that built itself up out of, and fell in decay into, the same sort of matter as inorganic nature would have been, happening of itself, miraculous, they were driven to believe in a spontaneous generation, that is, in the emergence of the organic from the inorganic, which was just as much of a miracle. Thus they went on, devising intermediate stages and transitions, assuming the existence of organisms which stood lower down than any yet known, but themselves had as forerunners still more primitive efforts of nature to achieve life, primitive forms of which no one would ever catch sight, for they were all of less than microscopic size, and previous to whose hypothetic existence the synthesis of protein compounds must already have taken place. What then was life? It was warmth, the warmth generated by a form-preserving instability, a fever of matter, which accompanied the process of ceaseless decay and repair of albumin molecules that were too impossibly complicated, too impossibly ingenious in structure. It was the existence of the actually impossible to exist, of a half-sweet, half-painful balancing or scarcely balancing, in this restricted and feverish process of decay and renewal upon the point of existence. It was not matter, and it was not spirit, but something between the two, a phenomenon conveyed by matter, like the rainbow on the waterfall, and like the flame. Yet, why not material? It was sentient to the point of desire and disgust. The shamelessness of matter becomes sensible of itself, the incontinent form of being. It was a secret and ardent stirring in the frozen chastity of the universal. It was a stolen and voluptuous impurity of sucking and secreting, an exhalation of carbonic acid gas and material impurities of mysterious origin and composition. It was a pullulation, an unfolding, a form-building, made possible by the overbalancing of its instability, yet controlled by the laws of growth inherent within it, of something brewed out of water, albumin, salt, and fats, which was called flesh, and which became form, beauty, a lofty image, and yet all the time the essence of sensuality and desire. For this form and beauty were not spirit-born, nor, like the form and beauty of sculpture, conveyed by a neutral and spirit-consumed substance, which could in all purity make beauty perceptible to the senses. Rather was it conveyed and shaped by the somehow awakened voluptuousness of matter, of the organic, dying living substance itself, the reeking flesh. As he lay there above the glittering valley, lapped in the bodily warmth preserved to him by fur and wool, in the frosty night illumined by the brilliance from a lifeless star, the image of life displayed itself to young Hans Castorp. It hovered before him, somewhere in space, remote from his grasp, yet near his sense. This body, this opaquely whitish form, giving out exhalations, moist, clammy. The skin with all its blemishes and native impurities, with its spots, pimples, discolorations, irregularities. Its horny, scale-like regions, covered over by soft streams and whirls of rudimentary lanugo. It leaned there, set off against the cold lifelessness of the inanimate world, in its own vaporous sphere, relaxed, the head crowned with something cool, horny and pigmented, which was an outgrowth of its skin, the hands clasped at the back of the neck. It looked down at him beneath drooping lids, out of eyes made to appear slanting by a racial variation in the lid formation. Its lips were half open, even a little curled. It rested its weight on one leg. The hip bone stood out sharply under the flesh, while the other, relaxed, nestled its slightly bent knee against the inside of the supporting leg and poised the foot only upon the toes. It leaned thus, turning to smile, the gleaming elbows akimbo, in the paired symmetry of its limbs and trunk. The acrid, steaming shadows of the armpits corresponded in a mystic triangle to the pubic darkness, just as the eyes did to the red, epithelial mouth opening, and the red blossoms of the breast to the navel lying perpendicularly below. Under the impulsion of a central organ and of the motor nerves originating in the spinal marrow, chest and abdomen functioned, the peritoneal cavity expanded and contracted, the breath, warmed and moistened by the mucous membrane of the respiratory canal, saturated with secretions, streamed out between the lips after it had joined its oxygen to the hemoglobin of the blood in the air cells of the lungs. For Hans Castorp understood that this living body, in the mysterious symmetry of its blood-nourished structure, penetrated throughout by nerves, veins, arteries, and capillaries, with its inner framework of bones, marrow-filled tubular bones, blade bones, vertebrae, which with the addition of lime had developed out of the original gelatinous tissue and grown strong enough to support the body weight, with the capsules and well-oiled cavities, ligaments and cartilages of its joints, its more than 200 muscles, its central organs that served for nutrition and respiration, for registering and transmitting stimuli, its protective membranes, serous cavities, its glands rich in secretions, with the system of vessels and fissures of its highly complicated interior surface, communicating through the body openings with the outer world. He understood that this ego was a living unit of a very high order, remote indeed from those very simple forms of life which breathed, took in nourishment, even thought, with the entire surface of their bodies. He knew it was built up out of myriads of such small organisms, which had had their origin in a single one, which had multiplied by recurrent division, adapted themselves to the most varied uses and functions, separated, differentiated themselves, thrown out forms which were the condition and result of their growth. This body, then, which hovered before him, this individual and living I, was a monstrous multiplicity of breathing and self-nourishing individuals, which, through organic conformation and adaptation to special ends, had parted to such an extent with their essential individuality, their freedom and living immediacy, had so much become anatomic elements that the functions of some had become limited to sensibility toward light, sound, contact, warmth. Others only understood how to change their shape or produce digestive secretions through contraction. Others, again, were developed and functional to no other end than protection, support, the conveyance of the body juices, or reproduction. There were modifications of this organic plurality united to form the higher ego, cases where the multitude of subordinate entities were only grouped in a loose and doubtful way to form a higher living unit. The student buried himself in the phenomenon of cell colonies. He read about half-organisms, algae, whose single cells, enveloped in a mantle of gelatin, often lay apart from one another, yet were multiple cell formations which, if they had been asked, would not have known whether to be rated as a settlement of single-celled individuals or as an individual single unit, and, in bearing witness, would have vacillated quaintly between the I and the we. Nature here presented a middle stage, between the highly social union of countless elementary individuals to form the tissues and organs of a superior I and the free individual existence of these simpler forms. The multiple-celled organism was only a stage in the cyclic process, which was the course of life itself, a periodic revolution from procreation to procreation. The act of fructification, the sexual merging of two cell bodies, stood at the beginning of the upbuilding of every multiple-celled individual, as it did at the beginning of every row of generations of single elementary forms, and led back to itself. For this act was carried through many species which had no need of it to multiply by means of proliferation, until a moment came when the non-sexually produced offspring found themselves once more constrained to a renewal of the copulative function, and the circle came full. Such was the multiple state of life, sprung from the union of two parent cells, the association of many non-sexually originated generations of cell units. Its growth meant their increase, and the generative circle came full again when sex cells, specially developed elements for the purpose of reproduction, had established themselves and found the way to a new mingling that drove life on afresh. Our young adventurer, supporting a volume of embryology on the pit of his stomach, followed the development of the organism from the moment when the spermatozoon, first among a host of its fellows, forced itself forward by a lashing motion of its hinder part, struck with its forepart against the gelatin mantle of the egg, and bored its way into the mount of conception, which the protoplasm of the outside of the ovum arched against its approach. There was no conceivable trick or absurdity it would not have pleased nature to commit by way of variation upon this fixed procedure. In some animals, the male was a parasite in the intestine of the female. In others, the male parent reached with his arm down the gullet of the female to deposit the semen within her, after which, bitten off and spat out, it ran away by itself upon its fingers, to the confusion of scientists, who for long had given it Greek and Latin names as an independent form of life. Hans Castorp lent an ear to the learned strife between ovists and animalculists, the first of whom asserted that the egg was in itself the complete little frog, dog, or human being, the male element being only the incitement to its growth, while the second saw in a spermatozoon, possessing head, arms, and legs, the perfected form of life shadowed forth, to which the egg performed only the office of nourisher in life's feast. In the end they agreed to concede equal meritoriousness to ovum and semen, both of which, after all, sprang from originally indistinguishable procreative cells. He saw the single-celled organism of the fructified egg on the point of being transformed into a multiple-celled organism by striation and division, saw the cell bodies attach themselves to the lamellae of the mucous membrane, saw the germinal vesicle, the blastula, close itself into form a cup or basin-shaped cavity and begin the functions of receiving and digesting food. That was the gastrula, the protozoon, primeval form of all animal life, primeval form of flesh-born beauty. Its two epithelia, the outer and the inner, the ectoderm and the entoderm, proved to be primitive organs out of whose foldings in and out were developed the glands, the tissues, the sensory organs, the body processes. A strip of the outer germinal layer, the ectoderm, thickened, folded into a groove, closed itself into a nerve canal, became a spinal column, became the brain. And as the fetal slime condensed into fibrous connective tissue, into cartilage, the colloidal cells beginning to show gelatinous substance instead of mucin, he saw in certain places the connective tissue take lime and fat to itself out of the sera that washed it, and begin to form bone. Embryonic man squatted in a stooping posture, tailed, indistinguishable from embryonic pig, with enormous abdomen and stumpy, formless extremities, the facial mask bowed over the swollen paunch. The story of his growth seemed a grim, unflattering science, like the cursory record of a zoological family tree. For while he had gill pockets like a roach, it seemed permissible, or rather unavoidable, contemplating the various stages of development through which he passed, to infer the very little humanistic aspect presented by primitive man in his mature state. His skin was furnished with twitching muscles to keep off insects. It was thickly covered with hair. There was a tremendous development of the mucous membrane of the olfactory organs. His ears protruded, were movable, took a lively part in the play of the features, and were much better adapted than ours for catching sounds. His eyes were protected by a third, nictating lid. They were placed sidewise, excepting the third, of which the pineal gland was the rudimentary trace, and which was able, looking upwards, to guard him from dangers from the upper air. Primitive man had a very long intestine, many molars, and sound pouches on the larynx the better to roar with. Also, he carried his sex glands on the inside of the intestinal cavity. Anatomy presented our investigator with charts of human limbs, skinned and prepared for his inspection. He saw their superficial and their buried muscles, sinews, and tendons, those of the thighs, the foot, and especially of the arm, the upper, and the forearm. He learned the Latin names with which medicine, that subdivision of the humanities, had gallantly equipped them. He passed on to the skeleton, the development of which presented new points of view, among them a clear perception of the essential unity of all that pertains to man, the correlation of all branches of learning. For here, strangely enough, he found himself reminded of his own field, or shall we say his former field, the scientific calling which he had announced himself as having embraced, introducing himself thus to Dr. Krokowski and his Settembrini on his arrival up here. In order to learn something, it had not much mattered what he had learned in his technical school about statics, about supports capable or flexion, about loads, about construction as the advantageous utilization of mechanical material. It would of course be childish to think that the science of engineering, the rules of mechanics, had found application to organic nature, but just as little might one say that they had been derived from organic nature. It was simply that the mechanical laws found themselves repeated and corroborated in nature. The principle of the hollow cylinder was illustrated in the structure of the tubular bones, in such a way that the static demands were satisfied with the precise minimum of solid structure. Hans Castorp had learned that a body which is put together out of staves and bands of mechanically utilizable matter, conformably to the demands made by draft and pressure upon it, can withstand the same weight as a solid column of the same material. Thus, in the development of the tubular bones, it was comprehensible that, step for step with the formation of the solid exterior, the inner parts, which were mechanically superfluous, changed to a fatty tissue, the marrow. The thigh bone was a crane, in the construction of which organic nature, by the direction she had given the shaft, carried out, to a hair, the same draft and pressure curves which Hans Castorp had had to plot in drawing an instrument serving a similar purpose. He contemplated this fact with pleasure. He enjoyed the reflection that his relation to the femur, or to organic nature generally, was now threefold. It was lyrical, it was medical, it was technological, and all of these, he felt, were one in being human. They were variations of one and the same pressing human concern. They were schools of humanistic thought. But with all this, the achievements of the protoplasm remained unaccountable. It seemed forbidden to life that it should understand itself. Most of the biochemical processes were not only unknown, it lay in their very nature that they should escape attention. Almost nothing was known of the structure or composition of the living unit called the cell. What use was there in establishing the components of lifeless muscle when the living did not let itself be chemically examined? The changes that took place when the rigor mortis set in were enough to make worthless all investigation. Nobody understood metabolism. Nobody understood the true inwardness of the functioning of the nervous system. To what properties did the taste corpuscles owe their reaction? In what consisted the various kinds of excitation of certain sensory nerves by odor-possessing substances? In what, indeed, the property of smell itself? The specific odors of man and beast consisted in the vaporization of certain unknown substances. The composition of the secretion called sweat was little understood. The glands that secreted it produced aromata, which among mammals undoubtedly played an important role, but whose significance for the human species we were not in a position to explain. The physiological significance of important regions of the body was shrouded in darkness. No need to mention the vermiform appendix, which was a mystery. In rabbits it was regularly found full of a pulpy substance, of which there was nothing to say as to how it got in or renewed itself. But what about the white and gray substance which composed the medulla? What of the optic thalamus and the gray inlay of the pons varolii? The substance composing the brain and marrow was so subject to disintegration, there was no hope whatever of determining its structure. What was it relieved the cortex of activity during slumber? What prevented the stomach from digesting itself? As sometimes, in fact, did happen after death? One might answer, life, a special power of resistance of the living protoplasm, but this would be not to recognize the mystical character of such an explanation. The theory of such an everyday phenomenon as fever was full of contradictions. Heightened oxidation resulted in increased warmth, but why was there not an increased expenditure of warmth to correspond? Did the paralysis of the sweat secretions depend upon contraction of the skin? But such contraction took place only in the case of chills and fever, for otherwise, in fever, the skin was more likely to be hot. Prickly heat indicated the central nervous system as the seat of the causes of heightened catabolism, as well as the source of that condition of the skin which we were content to call abnormal because we did not know how to define it. But what was all this ignorance, compared with our utter helplessness in the presence of such a phenomenon as memory, or of that other more prolonged and astounding memory which we called the inheritance of acquired characteristics? Out of the question to get even a glimpse of any mechanical possibility of explication of such performances on the part of the cell substance. The spermatozoon that conveyed to the egg countless complicated individual and racial characteristics of the father was visible only through a microscope. Even the most powerful magnification was not enough to show it as other than a homogeneous body, or to determine its origin. It looked the same in one animal as in another. These factors forced one to the assumption that the cell was in the same case as with the higher form it went to build up, that it too was already a higher form, composed in its turn by the division of living bodies, individual living units. Thus one passed from the supposed smallest unit to a still smaller one. One was driven to separate the elementary into its elements. No doubt at all, but just as the animal kingdom was composed of various species of animals, as the human animal organism was composed of a whole animal kingdom of cell species, so the cell organism was composed of a new and varied animal kingdom of elementary units, far below microscopic size, which grew spontaneously, increased spontaneously according to the law that each could bring forth only after its kind, and, acting on the principle of a division of labor, served together the next higher order of existence. Those were the genes, the living germs, bioblasts, biophores, lying there in the frosty night. Hans Castorp rejoiced to make acquaintance with them by name. Yet how, he asked himself excitedly, even after more light on the subject was forthcoming, how could their elementary nature be established? If they were living, they must be organic, since life depended upon organization. But if they were organized, then they could not be elementary, since an organism is not single but multiple. They were units within the organic unit of the cell. They built up. But if they were, then, however impossibly small they must themselves be built up, organically built up, as a law of their existence. For the conception of a living unit meant by definition that it was built up out of smaller units which were subordinate, that is, organized with reference to a higher form. As long as division yielded organic units possessing the properties of life, assimilation, and reproduction, no limits were set to it. As long as one spoke of living units, one could not correctly speak of elementary units, for the concept of unity carried with it in perpetuity the concept of subordinated, upbuilding unity, and there was no such thing as elementary life, in the sense of something that was already life, and yet elementary. And still, though without logical existence, something of the kind must be eventually the case, for it was not possible to brush aside like that the idea of the original procreation, the rise of life out of what was not life. That gap which in exterior nature we vainly sought to close, that between living and dead matter, had its counterpart in nature's organic existence, and must somehow either be closed up or bridged over. Soon or late, division must yield units which, even though in composition, were not organized and which mediated between life and absence of life, molecular groups, which represented the transition between vitalized organization and mere chemistry. But then, arrived at the molecule, one stood on the brink of another abyss, which yawned yet more mysteriously than that between organic and inorganic nature, the gulf between the material and the immaterial. For the molecule was composed of atoms, and the atom was nowhere near large enough even to be spoken of as extraordinarily small. It was so small, such a tiny, early, transitional mass, a coagulation of the unsubstantial, of the not yet substantial and yet substance-like of energy that it was scarcely possible yet, or, if it had been, was now no longer possible to think of it as material, but rather as mean and borderline between material and immaterial. The problem of another original procreation arose, far more wild and mysterious than the organic, the primeval birth of matter out of the immaterial. In fact, the abyss between material and immaterial yawned as widely, pressed as importunately, yes, more importunately to be closed, as that between organic and inorganic nature. There must be a chemistry of the immaterial, there must be combinations of the insubstantial, out of which sprang the material. The atoms might represent protozoa of material, by their nature substance and still not yet quite substance. Yet arrived at the not even small, the measure slipped out of the hands, for not even small meant much the same as enormously large, and the step to the atom proved to be without exaggeration portentous in the highest degree. For at the very moment when one had assisted at the final division of matter, when one had divided it into the impossibly small, at that moment there suddenly appeared upon the horizon the astronomical cosmos. The atom was a cosmic system, laden with energy, in which heavenly bodies rioted rotating about a center like a sun, through whose ethereal space comets drove with the speed of light years, kept in their eccentric orbits by the power of the central body. And that was as little a mere comparison as it would be were one to call the body of any multiple-celled organism a cell state. The city, the state, the social community regulated according to the principle of division of labor not only might be compared to organic life, it actually reproduced its conditions. Thus, in the inmost recesses of nature, as in an endless succession of mirrors, was reflected the macrocosm of the heavens, whose clusters, throngs, groups, and figures, paled by the brilliant moon, hung over the dazzling, frost-bound valley, above the head of our muffled adept. Was it too bold a thought that among the planets of the atomic solar system, those myriads and Milky Ways of solar systems which constituted matter, one or other of these inner-worldly heavenly bodies might find itself in a condition corresponding to that which made it possible for our Earth to become the abode of life? For a young man already rather befuddled inwardly, suffering from abnormal skin conditions, who was not without all and any experience in the realm of the illicit, it was a speculation which, far from being absurd, appeared so obvious as to leap to the eyes, highly evident, and bearing the stamp of logical truth. The smallness of these inner-worldly heavenly bodies would have been an objection irrelevant to the hypothesis, since the conception of large or small had ceased to be pertinent at the moment when the cosmic character of the smallest particle of matter had been revealed, while at the same time the conceptions of outside and inside had also been shaken. The atom world was an outside, as, very probably, the earthly star on which we dwelt was, organically regarded, deeply inside. Had not a researcher once, audaciously fanciful, referred to the beasts of the Milky Way, cosmic monsters whose flesh, bone, and brain were built up out of solar systems? But in that case, Hans Castorp mused, then in the moment when one thought to have come to the end, it all began over again from the beginning. For then, in the very innermost of his nature, and in the inmost of that innermost, perhaps there was just himself, just Hans Castorp, again, and 100 times Hans Castorp, with burning face and stiffening fingers, lying muffled on a balcony, with a view across the moonlit, frost-night high valley and probing, with an interest both humanistic and medical, into the life of the body. He held a volume of pathological anatomy in the red ray from his table lamp and conned its text and numerous reproductions. He read of the existence of parasitic cell juncture and of infectious tumors. These were forms of tissue, and very luxuriant forms too, produced by foreign cell bodies in an organism which had proved receptive to them, and in some way or other, one must probably say perversely, had offered them peculiarly favorable conditions. It was not so much that the parasite took away nourishment from the surrounding tissues, as that, in the process of building up and breaking down which went on in it as in every other cell, it produced organic combinations which were extraordinarily toxic, undeniably destructive, to the cells where it had been entertained. They had found out how to isolate the toxin from a number of microorganisms and produce it in concentrated form, and it was amazing to see what small doses of this substance, which simply belonged to a group of protein combinations, could, when introduced into the circulation of an animal, produce symptoms of acute poisoning and rapid degeneration. The outward sign of this inward decay was a growth of tissue, the pathological tumor, which was the reaction of the cells to the stimulus of the foreign bacilli. Tubercles developed, the size of a millet seed, composed of cells resembling mucous membrane, among or within which the bacilli lodged. Some of these were extraordinarily rich in protoplasm, very large and full of nuclei. However, all this good living soon led to ruin, for the nuclei of these monster cells began to break down, the protoplasm they contained to be destroyed by coagulation, and further areas of tissue to be involved. They were attacked by inflammation. The neighboring blood vessels suffered by contagion. White blood corpuscles were attracted to the seat of the evil. The breaking down proceeded apace, and meanwhile the soluble toxins released by the bacteria had already poisoned the nerve centers. The entire organization was in a state of high fever and staggered, so to speak with heaving bosom, toward dissolution. Thus far pathology, the theory of disease, the accentuation of the physical through pain. Yet in so far as it was the accentuation of the physical, at the same time accentuation through desire. Disease was a perverse, a dissolute form of life. And life itself? Was it perhaps only an infection, a sickening of matter? Was that which one might call the original procreation of matter only a disease, a growth produced by morbid stimulation of the immaterial? The first step toward evil, toward desire and death, was taken precisely then, when there took place that first increase in the density of the spiritual, that pathologically luxuriant morbid growth, produced by the irritant of some unknown infiltration. This, in part pleasurable, in part emotion of self-defense, was the primeval stage of matter, the transition from the insubstantial to the substance. This was the fall. The second creation, the birth of the organic out of the inorganic, was only another fatal stage in the progress of the corporeal toward consciousness, just as disease in the organism was an intoxication, a heightening and unlicensed accentuation of its physical state, and life was nothing but the next step on the reckless path of the spirit dishonored. Nothing but the automatic blush of matter roused to sensation and become receptive for that which awaked it. The books lay piled upon the table. One lay on the matting next his chair. That which he had latest read rested upon Hans Castorp's stomach and oppressed his breath. Yet no order went from the cortex to the muscles in charge to take it away. He had read down the page. His chin had sunk upon his chest. Over his innocent blue eyes the lids had fallen. He beheld the image of life in flower, its structure, its flesh-born loveliness. She had lifted her hands from behind her head. She opened her arms. On their inner side, particularly beneath the tender skin of the elbow points, he saw the blue branchings of the larger veins. These arms were of unspeakable sweetness. She leaned above him. She inclined unto him and bent down over him. He was conscious of her organic fragrance and the mild pulsation of her heart. Something warm and tender clasped him round the neck. Melted with desire and awe, he laid his hands upon the flesh of her upper arms, where the fine-grained skin over the triceps came to his sense so heavenly cool, and upon his lips he felt the moist clinging of her kiss. The dance of death. Not long after Christmas, the gentleman writer died, but before that event the Christmas holidays came and went, the two, or if you reckoned Holy Night the 3 feast days, to which Hans Castorp had looked forward with some alarm and head-shaking dubiety as to what they would really be like up here. In the event, they came on and passed like other days, with a morning, an afternoon, and an evening, only moderately unreasonable in respect of weather, it thought a little, and not greatly different from others of their kind. Outwardly, they had been somewhat garnished and set off. Inwardly, they had held sway in the heads and hearts of men for their appointed time. Then, leaving behind them some deposit of impressions out of the common run, they slipped away into the recent, then into the distant past. The Hofrath's son, Canute by name, came for the holidays and lived with his father in the wing of the building. A good-looking young man, save that his cervical vertebra was already too prominent. The presence of young barons could be felt in the air. The ladies showed a proneness to laugh, to bicker, and to adorn their persons. They boasted in conversation of having met Canute in the garden, the wood, or the English quarter. He himself had guests. A number of his fellow students came up to the valley, 6 or 7 young men who lodged in the village, but ate at the Hofrat's table, and with others of their course scoured the region in a body. Hans Castorp avoided them. He gave them a wide berth with Joachim whenever necessary. He felt no least desire to meet them. A whole world divided those up here from these singing, roving, staff-brandishing youths. He wished neither to see nor to hear anything of them. They looked, most of them, like northerners. There might be hamburgers among them, and Hans Castorp felt very shy of meeting his fellow townsmen. He had often uncomfortably considered the possibility that somebody or other from home might arrive at the Berghof. Had not the Hofrat said that Hamburg always furnished a handsome contingent to the establishment? There might be some among the bedridden and moribund, but the only one visible was a hollow-cheeked businessman, said to come from Cuxhaven, who had been sitting for 2 weeks at Frau Iltis's table. Hans Castorp, seeing him, rejoiced in the knowledge that one came little into touch with guests at other tables than one's own, and further, that his native sphere was an extended one. He saw that the presence of the man from Cuxhaven made no difference to his happiness, and this went far to relieve his fears about the arrival of other hamburgers. Christmas Eve came on apace. One day it was at hand, the next it was here. When first it had been talked of at table, to Hans Castorp's great surprise, it had been yet a good 6 weeks away, as much time as his original term up here, plus the 3 weeks in bed. But those first 6 weeks, as he thought of them in retrospect, seemed a very long time, while the 6 just past had been insignificant. His fellow guests were right to make light of them. 6 weeks, why, that was not so many as the week had days. Little indeed, when one considered what a small affair a week was from Monday to Sunday, and then Monday again. One needed only to see how valueless the next smaller time unit was to realize that not much could come even of a whole row of them put together. Rather, the total effect was to intensify the process of contraction, shrinkage, blurring, and effacement. What was one day, taken for instance from the moment one sat down to the midday meal to the same moment 24 hours afterwards? It was, to be sure, 24 hours, but equally it was the simple sum of nothings. Or take an hour spent in the rest cure, at the dinner table, or on the daily walk, and these ways of employing the time unit practically exhausted its possibilities. What was an hour? Again, nothing. And nothing were all these nothings. They were not serious in the nature of them, taken together. The only unit it was possible to regard with seriousness was the smallest one of all, those 7 times 60 seconds during which one held the thermometer between one's lips and continued one's curve. They, indeed, were full of matter and tenacious of life. They could expand into a little eternity. They formed small concretions of high density within the scurrying shadows of time's general course. The holidays disturbed but little the even tenor of the Berghof ways. A well-grown fir tree had been set up a few days beforehand on the right-hand wall of the dining room, the side wall next the bad Russian table. A waft of its fragrance came to the noses of the diners now and then, above the heavy odors of the food, and wakened something like pensiveness in the eyes of a few among the guests seated at the 7 tables. When they came to supper on the 24th, they found the tree gaily decked with tinsel, little glass balls, gilded pine cones, tiny apples and nets, and varied confections. The colored wax tapers burned throughout the meal and afterwards. And a tiny, taper-decked tree burned likewise, it was said, in the rooms of the bedridden and moribund. Each had his own. The parcel post in the last few days had been very heavy. Joachim Ziemßen and Hans Castorp received carefully packed remembrances from their faraway home and spread them out in their rooms. Judicious gifts of cravats and other articles of clothing, expensive trifles in leather and nickel, and quantities of Christmas cakes, nuts, apples, and marzipan. The cousins looked doubtfully at these last supplies, wondering whenever they should have occasion to consume them. Schelin, as Hans Castorp knew, had not only packed his presents, but bought them, after consultation with the uncles. There was a letter, too, from James T. Appel, typescript to be sure, but upon heavy paper with his private letterhead, communicating his own and his father's best wishes for the holidays and for a speedy recovery, and including at once greetings for the oncoming new year as well, a sensible and practical procedure which followed Hans Castorp's own, he having sent his Christmas messages betimes, under cover with the monthly clinical report. The tree in the dining room burned, crackled, and dispensed its fragrance, waking the minds and hearts of the guests to a realization of the day. People had dressed for dinner, the men wore evening clothes and the women jewels, mayhap presents from loving husbands down below. Claudia Chowchat had exchanged the customary sweater for a frock with a hint of the fanciful about it, suggesting a national costume, Russian peasant or Balkan, perhaps Bulgarian. A light-colored, flowing, and girdled arrangement, embroidered and set with tiny tinsel ornaments. Such a garment gave her figure an unwanted softness and fullness, and suited what Settembrini called her Tartar physiognomy, particularly the prairie wolf's eyes. They were gay at the good Russian table. There the first champagne cork was heard to pop. It set the example, which was followed by nearly all the others. At the cousins' table it was the great-aunt who dispensed champagne for her niece and Marussia, and treated the others as well. The menu was choice. It finished with cheese straws and bonbons, to which the guests added coffee and liqueurs. Now and then a twig would flare up on the Christmas tree. There would be work to put it out, and shrill, immoderate panic among the ladies. Toward the end of the meal Settembrini came to sit for a while at the end of the cousins' table. He wore his everyday clothes and sported his toothpick. He quizzed Frau Storr with spirit and made a few remarks about the carpenter's son and rabbi of humanity, whose birthday they fancied they were celebrating today. Whether he had actually lived, Settembrini said, was uncertain, yet his time had given birth to an idea which had continued its triumphant course even up to today, the idea of the dignity of the human spirit, the idea of equality. In a word, they were celebrating the birth of individualistic democracy, and to it he would empty the glass they gave him. Frau Storr found his remarks equivoque and unfeeling. She rose under protest to the toast, and as the other tables were being emptied, they followed the general movement toward the drawing rooms. Hofrat barons, with Canute and Fräulein von Mylendonk, attended the social evening for half an hour. The occasion was to be signalized by the presentation of the gift to the head of the establishment, which accordingly took place in the room with the optical apparatus. The Russians presented their gift, a large round silver plate, with the Hofrat's monogram engraved in the middle. Its utter inutility was plain to every eye. He might at least lie on the chaise longue which was the gift to the rest of the guests, though it was at present without cover or cushions, having merely a cloth drawn over it. The head end was adjustable. Baron stretched out full length, with his silver plate under his arm, closed his eyes, and began to snore like a sawmill, giving out that he was Fafner with the treasure hoard. Much laughter and applause ensued. Frau Chowchat laughed so hard that her eyes became two cracks, and her mouth stood open. Precisely, Hans Castorp remarked, as had been the case with Pribislav Hip when he laughed. Directly the head went out, the guests sat down to cards, the Russians occupying, as usual, the small salon. Some of the patients still stood about the room where the Christmas tree was, watching the candle stumps die down in their sockets and munching the goodies hanging from the boughs. Here and there at the tables, which were already laid for breakfast, sat a solitary person, with his head on his hand, silently brooding. Christmas Day was damp and misty. These were clouds they were among, barons asserted. Mist there was none, up here. But mist or clouds, the damp was perceptible. The surface of the lying snow began to thaw, grew soft and porous. In the rest cure, one's face and hands were stiff and red. One suffered far more than in colder, sunny weather. The feast day was marked by an evening concert, a real concert with rows of chairs and printed programs, offered to the guests by Haus Berghof, consisting of songs by a professional singer who lived up here and gave lessons. She wore 2 medals pinned side by side on her corsage, had arms like sticks, and a voice whose peculiar toneless quality cast a saddening light upon the grounds for her stay in these regions. She sang. Her accompanist was likewise a resident. Frau Chowchat sat in the first row, but took advantage of the intermission to go out, leaving Hans Castorp free to enjoy the music in peace. After all, it was music, and to read the text of the songs, as printed upon the program. Settembrini sat a while beside him, and made a few plastic and resilient phrases upon the dull quality of the singer's bel canto, expressing also ironic satisfaction over the home talent displayed in the entertainment. It was so charming, he said, that they were just among themselves. Then he too went away. To tell truth, Hans Castorp was not sorry to see the backs of them both, the narrow-eyed one and the pedagogue. He could the better devote himself to the singing and draw comfort from the reflection that all over the world, even in the most extraordinary places, music was made, very likely even on polar expeditions. One had a slight differentiating consciousness of the day after Christmas, something that just made it not quite the same as an ordinary Sunday or weekday. Then it was over, and the whole holiday lay in the past, or, equally, it lay in the distant future, a year away. 12 months would bring it round again, 7 more than the time Hans Castorp had spent up here. But just after the Christmas season, and before the New Year broke, the gentleman writer died. The cousins learned of the death from Fritz Rotbein's nurse, Alfreda Schildknecht, called Sister Berta, who met them in the corridor and discreetly communicated the sad event. Hans Castorp felt a profound interest, partly because the signs of life he had heard from the gentleman writer were among the earliest impressions of his stay up here, those which had first, or so it seemed to him, called up the flush to his face which since had never left it, but partly also upon moral, one might almost say upon spiritual grounds. He detained Joachim long in talk with the deaconess, who hung with the extreme of pleasure upon their conversation. It was a wonder, she said, that the gentleman writer had lived over the holidays. He had long since shown himself a doughty cavalier, but what it was he breathed with, at the end, nobody could tell. 4 days and days he had lived only by the aid of enormous quantities of oxygen. Yesterday alone he had consumed 40 containers, at 6 francs apiece. That mounted up, the gentlemen could reckon the cost themselves, and his wife, in whose arms he had died, was left wholly penniless. Joachim expressed disapproval of the expenditure. Why delay by these torturing and costly artificial expedients a death absolutely certain to supervene? One could not blame the man for blindly consuming the precious gas they urged upon him. But those in charge should have behaved with more reason. They should have let him go his way, in God's name, quite aside from the circumstances, more so when taking them into consideration. The living, after all, had their rights, and so on. Hans Castorp disagreed emphatically. His cousin, he said, talked almost like Settembrini, without any regard or reverence for suffering. The man had died in the end, that finished it. There was no more to be done to show one's concern, and it had been due to the dying to spend what one could. Thus Hans Castorp. He only hoped the Hofrat had not showed a lack of decent feeling by railing at the poor man at the end. There had been no need, Fräulein Schildknecht said. Only one little thoughtless effort he had made to escape, to spring out of bed, but the merest hint of the futility of such a proceeding had been enough to make him desist once and for all. Hans Castorp went to view the gentleman writer's mortal remains. He did this of set purpose, to show his contempt for the prevailing system of secrecy, to protest against the egotistic policy of seeing and hearing nothing of such events, to register by his act his disapproval of the other's practice. He had tried to introduce the subject of the death at table, but was met with such a flat and callous rebuff on all sides as both to anger and embarrass him. Frau Storr had been downright gruff. What did he mean by introducing such a subject? What kind of upbringing had he had? The house regulations protected the patients from having such things come to their knowledge, and now here was a young whippersnapper bringing it up at table, and even in the presence of Dr. Blumenkohl, whom the same fate might any day overtake, this behind her hand. If it happened again, she would complain. Then it was that, thus reproved, Hans Castorp had taken and expressed a resolve. He would visit their departed comrade and discharge the last duty of silent respect toward his remains. He persuaded Joachim to do the same. Sister Berta arranged that they be admitted to the gentleman writer's room, which lay in the first story beneath their own. The widow received them, a small, distracted blonde, much reduced by night watching, with a red nose, her handkerchief before her mouth, and wearing a plaid cloak, with the collar turned up, as it was very cold in the room. The heat was turned off, the balcony door stood open. The young people said what was fitting to say, in voices respectfully subdued. Then, upon a woeful gesture from the widow, they passed through the room to the bed, walking on their tiptoes and weaving reverently forward. They stood by the dead, each after his fashion. Joachim with heels together, half inclined in a salute, Hans Castorp relaxed and pensive, with hands clasped before him and head on one side, much as he often stood to listen to music. The gentleman rider lay with his head pillowed high, so that his body, that elongated structure, the outgrowth of life's manifold processes, with the elevation of the feet at the end beneath the sheet, looked very flat, almost like a board. A garland of flowers lay at about the knees. A palm leaf outstanding from it touched the great, yellow, bony hands resting crossed upon the sunken breast. Yellow and bony was the face too, with its bald skull and hooked nose, its angular cheekbones and bushy, reddish-yellow mustaches, whose full curve gave the gray and stubbly hollows of the cheeks a yet hollower look. The eyes were closed, with a certain unnatural definiteness. Pressed down, not shut, thought Hans Castorp. That was what they called the last service of love, but it happened rather as a service to the survivors than to the dead. And it must be done betimes too, soon after death, for if the myosin process went far in the muscles, it would be too late. He would lie there and stare, and one could no longer sustain the illusion of his slumber. Perfectly at home, in more than one respect in his element, Hans Castorp stood at the bier, expertly reverential. "He seems to sleep," said he humanely, though such was far from being the case. Then, in a voice appropriately subdued, he began a conversation with the widow, eliciting information about the sufferings, the last days and moments of her departed husband, and the arrangements for transporting the body to Carinthia, displaying a sympathy and conversance that was in part physicianly, in part priestly and moralizing. The widow, speaking in her drawling, nasal, Austrian accent, with now and then a sob, found it remarkable that young folk should so occupy themselves with a stranger's pain. Hans Castorp answered that he and his cousin were themselves ill, that he, when still very young, had stood at the deathbed of near relatives. He was a double orphan and, if he might say so, long familiar with the sight of death. She asked what profession he had chosen. He replied that he had been an engineer. "Had been?" she queried. "Had been," he replied, in the sense that his illness and a stay up here of still undetermined length had come between him and his work. That might mean a considerable interruption, even a turning point in his career. He could not tell. Joachim, at this, searched his face in some alarm. And his cousin? He was a soldier, was at present in training for an officer. "Ah," she said, "the trade of a soldier is another serious calling. One must be prepared to come into close touch with death. It is well to accustom oneself to the sight beforehand." She dismissed the cousins with thanks and expressions of friendliness, which could not but touch them, considering her distressed state and the bill for oxygen her departed husband had left behind him. They returned to their own story, Hans Castorp greatly pleased and edified by the visit. "Requiescat in pace," he said. "Sit tibi terra levis. Requiem aeternam dona ei, Domini." You see, when death is in question, when one speaks to or of the dead, then the Latin comes in force. It is, so to say, the official language. So then you see that death is a thing apart. But it isn't a humanistic gesture, speaking Latin in honor of death, and the Latin isn't what you learn at school, either. The spirit of it is quite different, one might almost say hostile. It is ecclesiastical Latin, monkish Latin, medieval dialect, a sort of dull, monotonous, underground chanting. Settembrini has no use for it. It is nothing for humanists and republicans and such-like pedagogues. It comes from quite another point of the compass. I find one ought to be clear about these two intellectual trends, or perhaps it would be better to say states of mind. I mean the devout and the free-thinking. They both have their good sides. What I have against Settembrini's, the free-thinking line, is that he seems to imagine it has a corner in human dignity. That's exaggerated, I consider, because the other has its own kind of dignity too, and makes for a tremendous lot of decorum and correct bearing and uplifting ceremony. More, in fact, than the free thinking, when you remember it has our human infirmity and proneness to err directly in mind, and thoughts of death and decay play such an important role in it. Have you seen Don Carlos given at the theater? Do you remember at the Spanish court, when King Philip comes in, all in black, with the garter and the golden fleece, and takes off his hat? It looks pretty much like one of our melons. He lifts it from the top and says, "Cover, my lords," or something like that. That is the last degree of formality, I should think. No talk of any free and easy manners there. The Queen herself says, "In my own France, how different." Of course it is too precise for her, too fussy. She would like it a little gayer and more human. But what is human? Everything is human. I find all that strict punctilio and God-fearing solemnity of the Spanish is a very dignified kind of humanity, while on the other hand the word human can be used to cover up God knows what loose and slovenly ways. You know that yourself. I do indeed, Joachim said. Naturally, I can't abide any kind of looseness or slovenliness. There must be discipline. Yes, you say that as a soldier, and I must admit the military has an understanding of these matters. The widow was right when she said your trade is a solemn one that has to reckon on coming to grips with death. You have your tight-fitting, immaculate uniform with a stiff collar. There's your bienséance for you. Then your regulations of rank and military obedience and all the forms you preserve toward each other. Quite in the Spanish spirit, there is something reverent about it. I can do with it very well, at bottom. We civilians ought to show more of the same spirit in our customs and manners. I should really like it and find it fitting. I think the world and life generally is such as to make it appropriate for us all to wear black, with a starched ruff instead of your stand-up collar, and for all our intercourse with each other to be subdued and ceremonial, and mindful of death. That would seem right and moral to me. There is another of Settembrini's arrogant ideas. I may tell him so some time. He thinks he has a monopoly of morals as well as of human dignity, with his talk about practical life work and Sunday services in the name of progress, as though one hadn't something else to think about on Sundays, besides progress, and his systematic elimination of suffering. You have not heard anything about that, but he has instructed me on the subject, and it is to be systematically eliminated by means of a lexicon. I may find all that positively immoral, but what of it? I don't tell him so, naturally. He fairly goes for me, you know, of course in his plastic way, and says, "I warn you, engineer." But a person can take leave to think what he pleases, at least. Sire, grant freedom of thought. Let me tell you something, he went on. They had by now arrived in Joachim's room, and Joachim was making ready for the rest cure. Let me tell you something I propose to do. We live up here, next door to the dying, close to misery and suffering, and not only we act as though we had nothing to do with it, but it is all carefully arranged in order to spare us and prevent our coming into contact with it, or seeing anything at all. They will take away the gentleman rider while we are at breakfast or tea, and that I find immoral. The storewoman was furious, simply because I mentioned his death. That's too absurd for words. She is ignorant, to be sure, and thinks that lies from Weiss comes out of Tannhauser. She said so the other day. But even so, she might have a little human feeling, and the rest of them too. Well, I have made up my mind to concern myself a bit in future with the severe cases and the moribund. It will do me good. I feel our visit just now has done me good already. That poor chap Reuter in number 25, whom I saw through the door when I first came, he has most likely long ago been gathered to his fathers and been spirited away on the quiet. His eyes were so enormous even then. But there are more of them. The house is full, and they keep coming. Sister Alfreda or the directress, or even Behrens himself, would most likely be glad to put us in the way of it. Say that one of the moribund was having a birthday and we hear of it, that could easily be brought about. Good. We send him, or her, whichever it is, a pot of flowers, and attention from 2 fellow guests who prefer to remain anonymous, with best wishes for recovery. It is always polite to say that. Then afterwards, of course, it is found out who sent it, and he or she, in her infirmity, lets us greet her in a friendly way, through the doorway. She may even ask us in for a minute, and we have a little human intercourse with him before he sinks away. That's how I imagine it. Are you agreed? For my part, my mind is made up." Joachim had not much to bring up against the plan. "It is against the rules of the house," he said. "In a certain way you would be transgressing them. But barons would probably be willing to make an exception and give permission if you wanted it, I should think. You might refer to your interest in the medical side." "Yes, among other things," Hans Castorp answered, for in truth somewhat involved motives lay at the bottom of his desire. His protest against the prevailing egotism was only one of these. There was also, and in particular, a spiritual craving to take suffering and death seriously and pay them the respect that was their due. Contact with the suffering and dying would, or so he hoped, feed and strengthen this craving of the spirit by counteracting the manifold woundings to which it was daily and hourly subjected, and which he felt the more keenly on account of the Sedembrinian critique. Instances there were only too many. If one had asked Hans Castorp for them, he would probably have mentioned certain persons who were admittedly not much ailing, and not under the smallest compulsion, but who made a pretext of slight illness to live up here, for their own pleasure, and because the life suited them. Such was the widow Hessenfeld, whom we have mentioned in passing. Her passion was betting. She staked against the gentleman every conceivable object upon every conceivable subject. The weather, the dishes at dinner, the result of the monthly examination, the prescribed length of stay of this or that person, the champions in skating, sleighing, bob racing, and skiing competitions, the duration of this or that amour among the guests of the cure, and 100 other, often quite indifferent or trifling subjects. Staked chocolate, champagne, and caviar, which were then ceremonially partaken of in the restaurant, or money, or cinematograph tickets, or even kisses, given and received. In brief, she brought with her passion for betting much life and excitement into the dining room, though her proceedings were not such as could be taken seriously by Hans Castorp, who even felt that her mere presence was prejudicial to the dignity of a serious cure. For he was inwardly concerned to protect that dignity and uphold it in his own eyes, though now, after nearly half a year among those up here, it cost him something to do so. The insight he gradually won into their lives and activities, their practices and points of view was not encouraging. We have mentioned the two slim young elegants, 17 and 18 years old, nicknamed Max and Moritz, whose exploits were the talk of the cure, and who were in the habit of climbing out of the window at night in order to play poker and dissipate down below in female society. Only lately, that is to say, perhaps a week after the New Year, for we must bear in mind that while we tell the story, time streams silently and ceaselessly on. It had been spread abroad at breakfast that the bathing master had just caught the pair, in crumpled evening clothes, lying on their beds. Even Hans Castorp laughed, but this, however humiliating it was to his better feelings, was nothing compared to the tales that circulated about a certain lawyer from Jitterbog, Einhoff by name, a man perhaps 40 years old, with a pointed beard and very hairy hands, who had taken the Swede's place at a Settembrini's table. It was reported of him not only that he came home drunk every night, but that recently he had failed to do even that, having been discovered lying in the meadow. He passed for a Don Juan. Frau Storr could point out the damsel, of whom it was also known that she had an affianced lover down in the flatland, who was seen at a certain hour coming out of Lawyer Einhoff's room, clad in a fur coat with combinations underneath, and nothing more. That was a scandal, not only to the general, but even more to Hans Castorp's private sense, and derogatory to his spiritual endeavors. It even came to this, that the thought of Lawyer Einhoff could not enter his mind without calling up there, by an association of ideas, the thought of Franchen Oberdank, the little creature with the sleek blonde head, whose mamma, a worthy dame from the provinces, had brought her up to the Berghof a few weeks before. Franchen's case, on her arrival, and even after the examination, had been thought a light one. But perhaps she had failed in the service of the cure. Perhaps hers was one of those cases in which the heir proved in the first instance to be good not against but for the disease. Or perhaps the child may have become involved in some intrigue, the excitement of which was seriously bad for her. For weeks after her arrival she entered the dining room fresh from a second examination, tossing her little handbag in the air and crying out in her fresh young voice, "Hurrah, hurrah! I shall have to stop a year." at which the whole room resounded with Homeric laughter. But 2 weeks later the whisper went round that Lawyer Einhoff had behaved like a blackguard to Franchin Oberdink. The expression is ours, or, rather, Hans Castorp's, for those who spread the news found it too old a story to be moved to the use of strong language. They shrugged their shoulders and gave it out as their view that it took two to play at such games, and that it was unlikely anything had happened against the will of either participant. This, at least, was Frau Storr's demeanor, her ethical reaction to the affair in question. Caroline Storr was dreadful. If anything had power to distract our young Hans Castorp in the course of his sincerely felt spiritual strivings, it was the personality, the very existence of this woman. Her perpetual malapropisms were quite enough. She said insolvent when she meant insolent, and uttered the most amazing rubbish by way of explaining the astronomical phenomena involved in an eclipse of the sun. One day, she almost reduced Settembrini to permanent stupefaction by telling him that she was reading a book from the library which would interest him, namely, Schiller's translation of Benedetto Cinelli. She adored expressions of a cheap and common stamp, worn threadbare by overuse, which got on Hans Castorp's nerves, as, for example, "You haven't the faintest idea," or "How utterly too." It had for long been the fashionable jargon to say simply gorgeous, to express the idea of brilliant or excellent. This phrase now proved to have outlived its usefulness. It was entirely prostituted, the juice quite sucked out of it, and Frau Storr clutched eagerly at the newest currency. Everything, whether in jest or earnest, was devastating. The bob run, the sweet for dinner, her own temperature, and this sounded equally offensive in her mouth. She had a boundless appetite for gossip. One day she might relate that Frau Salomon was wearing the most costly lace underwear in preparation for her examination, and prided herself very much upon her appearance before the physicians on these occasions. There was probably more truth than poetry in the statement. Hans Castorp himself had the impression that the examinations, quite aside from their result, had their pleasurable side for the ladies, and that they adorned themselves accordingly. But what should one say to Frau Storr's assertion that Frau Riedisch, from Posen, who, it was feared, suffered from tuberculosis of the spine, had to walk up and down entirely naked before Hofrat Barons for 10 minutes once a week? This statement was almost as improbable as it was objectionable, but Frau Storr swore to it by all that was holy, though it was hard to understand how the poor creature could expend so much zeal and energy and be so dogmatic upon matters like these, when her own personal condition gave so much cause for concern. She was sometimes seized by attacks of panic and whimpering, caused by the lassitude which seemed to be constantly on the increase, or by her rising curve, when she would come sobbing to table, the chapped red cheeks streaming with tears, and wail into her handkerchief. Behrens wanted to send her to bed. She would like to know what he had said behind her back was the matter with her. She wanted to look the truth in the face. One day she had remarked to her horror that her bed had been placed with the foot in the direction of the entrance door. The discovery nearly sent her into spasms. It was not easy to understand her rage and terror. Hans Castorp did not see at once what she meant, and inquired, "Well, and what then? What was there about the bed standing like that? For God's sake." Couldn't he understand? Feet first. She had made desperate outcry, and the position of the bed had to be altered at once, though it caused her to lie with her face to the light, and thus disturb her sleep. But none of this was really serious. It could not meet Hans Castorp's spiritual needs. A frightful occurrence, which happened at about this time, during a meal, made a profound impression upon him. Among the newer patients was a schoolmaster named Popov, a lean and silent man, with his equally lean and silent wife. They sat together at the good Russian table, and one day, while the meal was in full swing, the man was seized with a violent epileptic fit, and with that oft-described demoniac unearthly shriek fell to the floor, where he lay beside his chair, striking about him with dreadfully distorted arms and legs. To make matters worse, it was a fish dish that had just been handed, and there was ground for fear that Popov, in his spasm, might choke on a bone. The uproar was indescribable. The ladies, Frau Storr in the lead, with Mesdames Salomon, Riedisch, Hessenfeld, Magnus, Iltis, Levi, and the rest following hard upon, were taken in a variety of ways, some of them almost as badly as Popoff. Their yells resounded. Everywhere were twitching eyelids, gaping mouths, writhing torsos. One of them elected to faint, silently. There were cases of choking, some of them having been in the act of chewing and swallowing when the excitement began. Many of the guests at the various tables fled, through any available exit, even actually seeking the open, though the weather was very cold and damp. The whole occurrence, however, took a peculiar cast, offensive even beyond the horror of it, through an association of ideas due to Dr. Krokowski's latest lecture. In the course of his exposition of love as a power making for disease, the psychoanalyst had touched upon the falling sickness. This affliction, which, in pre-analytic times, he said, men had by turns interpreted as a holy, even a prophetic visitation, and as a devilish possession, he went on to treat of, half poetically, half in ruthlessly scientific terminology, as the equivalent of love and an orgasm of the brain. In brief, he had cast such an equivocal light upon the disease that his hearers were bound to see, in Popoff's seizure, an illustration of the lecture, an awful manifestation and mysterious scandal. The flight on the part of the ladies was, accordingly, a disguised expression of modesty. The Hofrat himself had been present at the meal. He, with Fräulein von Mylendonk and one or two more robust guests, carried the ecstatic from the room. Blue, rigid, twisted, and foaming at the mouth as he was, they put him down in the hall, where the doctors, the directress, and other people could be seen hovering over the unconscious man, whom they afterwards bore away on a stretcher. But a short time thereafter her Popoff, quite happy and serene, with his equally serene and happy wife, was to be seen sitting at the good Russian table, finishing his meal as though nothing had happened. Hans Castorp was present at this episode and evinced all the outward signs of concern and alarm, but at bottom he was not edified, God help him. True, Popoff might have choked on his mouthful of fish, but he had not. Perhaps, in all his unconscious mouthings and goings-on, he had all the while somehow taken jolly good care not to. Now he was sitting there, eating blithely away, as though he had never been behaving like a drunken berserk. Very probably he remembered nothing at all about it. But in his person he was not a man to strengthen Hans Castorp's respect for suffering. His wife, too, after her fashion, only added to those impressions of frivolous irregularity against which Hans Castorp wrestled and which he sought to counteract by coming into closer touch, despite the prevailing attitude, with the suffering and dying in the establishment. In the same story with the cousins, not far from their rooms, lay a young girl named Leila Jerngross. According to Sister Berta, she was about to die. Inside 10 days she had had 4 violent hemorrhages, and her parents had come, in the hope to take her home while she still lived. But it was impossible. The Hofrat said poor little Jerngross could not stand the journey. She was 16 or 17 years old. Hans Castorp saw here the opportunity to carry out his plan with the pot of flowers and the good wishes for speedy recovery. There was, it is true, no birthday feast to celebrate. In all human probability, little Leila would never see another. It came in the spring, Hans Castorp learned. But he felt the fact need not prevent his offering his respectful sympathy. When he went down with his cousin for their morning walk, he entered a flower shop near the courthouse, and breathing in agreeably the moist, earthy, scent-laden air, he chose with care from the array a charming hortensia and ordered it conveyed to the little sufferer's room with a card, upon which he wrote no names, but simply from 2 housemates with best wishes for recovery. All this was an exquisite activity to Hans Castorp. He enjoyed the fragrant breath of the plants, the soft warmth of the shop, after the cold outside, made his eyes fill with tears. His heart beat with a feeling of adventure and audacity, a conviction of the good sense of his modest enterprise, to which, privately, he ascribed a certain symbolic value. Leila Jerngross had no private nursing. She was under the immediate supervision of Fräulein von Mylendonk and the physicians. Sister Berta, too, went in and out of her room, and it was she who gave the young people news of the result of their attention. The little one, in her hopeless and circumscribed state, was as pleased as a child with the stranger's greeting. The pot stood at her bedside. She caressed it with eyes and hands, saw that it was kept watered, and even in her severest fits of coughing rested her tortured gaze upon it. Likewise the parents, retired Major Jerngross and wife, were touched and pleased, and since it was impossible for them, as complete strangers, to guess the givers, Fräulein Schildknecht could not, she confessed it, refrain from revealing the cousin's identity. She transmitted the desire of the whole family that they should come and receive the thanks due their gift, and thus, on the next day but one, the deaconess ushered the two on tiptoe into Leila's apartment. The dying girl was indeed a charming blonde creature, with eyes of true forget-me-not blue. Despite great loss of blood and the effort to breathe with an utterly insufficient remnant of sound lung tissue, she looked fragile indeed, yet not too distressing. She thanked them, and talked a little, in a pleasant, though toneless voice, while a faint rosy glow overspread her cheeks and lingered there. Hans Castorp suitably explained and excused his seeming intrusion, speaking in a low, moved voice, with delicate reverence. He did not lack much. The impulse was present in him, of falling upon his knees by the bedside, and he clasped the patient's hot little hand long and closely in his, despite its being not moist but actually wet, for the child's sweat secretion was so great, she perspired so much, that the flesh must have been shriveled, if the transudation had not been counteracted by copious draughts of lemonade, a carafe of which stood on the bedside table. The parents, afflicted as they were, sustained the brief colloquy with courteous inquiries as to the state of the cousin's health and other conversational devices. The major was a broad-shouldered man, with a low forehead and bristling mustaches, a tower of strength. His organic innocence of his little daughter's tisical tendency was plain to any eye. It was rather the mother who was responsible for the inherited taint. She was small and of a distinctly consumptive type, and her conscience seemed burdened with the knowledge of her fatal bequest. Leila, after 10 minutes' talk, gave signs of fatigue, or rather of overexcitement. The flush deepened in her cheek, and her forget-me-not eyes glittering disquietingly. The cousins, on a sign from the nurse, made their adieus, and then the poor mother followed them into the corridor and broke out into self-reproachings, which affected Hans Castorp very painfully. From her alone it came, she said remorsefully, again and again. Her husband had nothing whatever to do with it. Even she assured them, had been only temporarily affected, only a slight and superficial case, when she was quite a young girl. She had outgrown it entirely, had been sure that she was quite cured. For she had wished to marry, she had so longed to marry and live, and she had done it. Healed and sound she had wedded her dear husband, himself as sound as a berry, who on his side had no notion at all of such things. But sound and strong as he was, that had not helped. The dreadful, hidden, and forgotten thing had come to light in the child. It would end by destroying her. She, the mother, had escaped and was entering into a healthy old age, but the poor, lovely darling would die. The physicians gave them no hope, and she alone was to blame, with her buried past. The young people sought to console her, to say something about the possibility of a turn for the better. But the major's wife only sobbed and thanked them for all they had done, for the gift of the plant, and the diversion and pleasure their visit had brought her child. She lay there, poor little one, lonely and suffering upon her bed, while other young creatures were glad of life, and could dance with fine young men to their heart's desire, and even the disease could not kill the desire to dance. They had brought her a ray of sunshine. My God, it would be the last. The hortensia had been like homage at a ball, the brief chat with the two fine young cavaliers a tiny affaire de coeur. She, the mother, had seen it. All this impressed Hans Castorp rather painfully, and she had pronounced the French badly too, which irritated him beyond words. He was no fine cavalier. He had visited little Leila only as a protest against the ruling spirit of egotism in the place, and in a physicianly and priestly capacity. He was rather put out over the turn the affair had taken, and the interpretation the mother had put upon it. But, on the other hand, he felt a lively pleasure at having actually carried out his undertaking. Two impressions in particular lingered from the enterprise. One, the earthy odors of the flower shop. The other, Layla's wet little hand. They had sunk into his mind and soul. And as thus a beginning had been made, he arranged on the same day with Alfreda Schildknecht a visit to her patient, Fritz Rotbian, who was as bored with life as his nurse, though to him, unless all signs failed, only a short term still remained. Nothing for it but that the good Joachim must go along. Hans Castorp's charitable impulse was stronger than his cousin's distaste, which the latter, moreover, could only manifest by silence and averted eyes, since he could not stand for it except by betraying a lack of Christian feeling. Hans Castorp saw that very well and drew advantage from it. Equally, he perceived the military grounds for the distaste, but if he himself felt the happier and stronger for such undertakings, if they seemed to him conducive to good ends? In that case, he must simply override Joachim's silent disapproval. He deliberated with his cousin whether they might send or bring flowers to Fritz Rotbian, he being a man. He desired to do so. Flowers, he felt, were proper to the occasion, and the purchase of the pretty, well-shaped purple hortensia had greatly pleased him. He came to the conclusion that Fritz Rotbian's sex was, so to speak, neutralized by his mortal state. Also that there was no need of a birthday to serve as excuse, since the dying are to be treated as though in enjoyment of a permanent birthday. Thus minded, he sought once more with his cousin the warm, earthy, scent-laden air of the flower shop, and brought back a dewy, fragrant bunch of roses, wallflowers, and carnations, with which they entered Herr Rotbian's room, ushered by Alfreda Schildknecht. The sufferer was not more than 20 years old, if so much, but rather bald and grey. He looked waxen and wasted, with large hands, nose, and ears, showed himself glad unto tears for the kindness of the visit and the diversion it afforded him, and indeed, out of weakness, did weep a little as he greeted the two and received the bouquet. His first words, uttered almost in a whisper, were with reference to the flowers, and he went on to talk about the European flower trade and its ever-increasing proportions, about the enormous exportation from the nurseries of Nice and Cannes, the shipments by trainload and post that went off daily from these places all over Europe, about the wholesale markets of Paris and Berlin, and the supplies for Russia. For he was a businessman. His point of view was the commercial one, and would be so long as life remained to him. His father, a doll manufacturer in Coburg, had sent him to England to be educated, he told them in a whisper, and there he had fallen ill. They had taken his fever for typhoid, and treated it accordingly, with liquid diet, which had much reduced him. Up here they had let him eat, and eat he had. In the sweat of his brow he had sat in his bed, and tried to build himself up. But it was all too late, the intestinal tract was already involved. In vain they sent him tongue and spiced eel from home. He could not digest it. His father, whom Baron summoned by telegraph, was now on the way from Coburg, for decisive action was to be taken. They would try at least what they could do with rib resection, though the chances of success diminished daily. Rotbian conveyed all this in a whisper, and with great objectivity. Even in the matter of the operation he took a business view, for so long as he lived, that would be his angle of approach. The expense, he whispered, was fixed at 1,000 francs, including the anesthesia of the spinal cord. Practically the whole thoracic cavity was involved, 6 or 8 ribs, and the question was whether it would pay. Barons would like to persuade him, but the doctor's interest in the matter was single, whereas his own seemed equivocal. He was not at all clear that he would not do better just to die in peace, with his ribs intact. It was hard to advise him. The cousins thought the Hofrat's brilliant reputation as a surgeon should be considered. It was agreed at length to leave the decision to the elder Rotbian, soon to arrive. Young Fritz wept again a little as they took their leave. His tears fell in strange contrast to the dry matter-of-factness of his thought and speech. He begged the gentlemen to repeat their visit, and they willingly promised to do so, but it did not come about. The doll manufacturer arrived in the evening. Next morning they proceeded to operate, and after that young Fritz was in no condition to receive callers. 2 days later, passing the room with Joachim, Hans Castorp saw that it was being turned out. Sister Alfreda had already packed her little trunk and left the Berghof, to go to another moribundus in another establishment. Heaving a sigh, her eyeglass ribbon behind her ear, She had beta-ken herself thither, since such and only such was the prospect life held out to her. An empty room, a room that had been vacated, with its furniture turned topsy-turvy and both doors standing wide, as one saw it in passing, on the way to the dining room or one's daily walks, was a most significant, and yet withal such an accustomed sight that one thought little of it, especially when one had, in one's time, taken possession of just such a vacated room and settled down to feel at home in it. Sometimes you knew whose room it had been, and that indeed gave you to think. Thus a week later Hans Castorp passed by and saw Leila Jerngross's room in just that condition, and in this instance his understanding rebelled for the moment against what he saw. He stood and looked, perplexed and startled, and the Hofrat came that way, to whom he spoke. "I see it is being turned out here. Good morning, Hofrat." Then little Leila. "I," answered Behrens, and shrugged his shoulders. After a pause for the meaning of the gesture to take effect, he added, "So you paid court to her in form, just before the doors were shut? Decent of you, to take an interest in my lungers, considering you are relatively sound yourself. Shows a pretty trait of character. No, don't be shy, quite a pretty trait. Shall I introduce you a bit here and there? What? I have all sorts of jailbirds in their little cells if you want to see them. Just now, for instance, I am on my way to visit my overfilled. Want to come? I'll introduce you as a sympathetic fellow sufferer." Hans Castorp replied that the Hofrat had taken the words out of his mouth and offered him what he was on the point of asking. He would gratefully accept the permission to accompany him, but who was the overfilled, and how did Hofrat Behrens mean him to understand the title? "Quite literally," said the Hofrat. "Quite exactly, no metaphors. She'll tell you about herself." A few paces brought them before the room, and the Hofrat entered, bidding his companion wait. As the double doors opened, the visitor heard the sound of clear and hearty laughter, which yet sounded short-winded, as though the person within were gasping for breath. Then it was shut away, but he heard it again when, a few minutes later, he was bidden to enter, and Behrens presented him to the blonde lady lying there in bed and looking at him with curiosity out of her blue eyes. She lay half-sitting, supported by pillows, and seemed very restless. She laughed incessantly, struggling the while for breath, a high, purling, silver laughter, as though her plight excited or amused her. She was amused too, very likely, by the Hofrat's turns of phrase in introducing the visitor, and called out repeated thanks and goodbyes as he went off, waved her hand at his departing back, sighed melodiously, with runs of silver merriment, and pressed her hand against her heaving breast under the batiste nightgown. Her legs, it seemed, were never still. The lady's name was Frau Zimmermann. Hans Castorp knew her by sight. She had sat for some weeks at the table with Frau Salomon and the lad who bolted his food. Then she had disappeared, and so far as Hans Castorp may have troubled about it, he supposed that she had gone home. Now he found her again, under the name of the overfilled, and awaited an explanation. "Ha ha ha ha," she caroled, in high glee, holding her fluttering bosom. "Frightfully funny man, is Behrens, killingly funny, makes you die of laughing. But sit down, Herr Kasten or Garson or whatever your name is, you have such a funny name. Ha ha, ha ha. You must please excuse me. Do sit down on that chair near my feet, but please don't mind if I thrash about with my legs, I cannot help it." She was almost pretty, with clear-cut, rather too well-defined though agreeable features and a tiny double chin. Her lips and even the tip of her nose were blue, probably from lack of air. Her hands had an appealing thinness. The laces of the nightdress set them off, but she could keep them quiet no more than her feet. Her throat was like a girl's, with salt cellars above the delicate collarbones, and her breast, heaving and struggling under the nightgown with her laughter and gasping breaths, looked tender and young. Hans Castorp decided to send or bring her flowers, a bouquet from the nurseries of Nice and Cannes, dewy and fragrant. With some misgiving he joined in her breathless and volatile mirth. "And so you go round visiting the fever cases?" she asked. "That's very amusing and friendly of you. But I'm not a fever case. That is, I wasn't in the least until just now, until this business. Listen and tell me if it isn't just the funniest thing you ever heard in all your life." And wrestling for air, Amid trills and roulades of laughter, she related her story. She had come up a little ill. Well, ill, of course, for otherwise she would not have come. Perhaps not quite a slight case, but rather slight than grave. The pneumothorax, that newest triumph of modern surgical technique, so rapidly become popular, had been brilliantly successful in her case. She made most gratifying progress. Her condition was entirely satisfactory. Her husband, for she was married, though childless, might hope to have her home again in 3 or 4 months. Then, to divert herself, she made a trip to Zurich. There had been no other reason for her going, save simply to amuse herself. She had amused herself to her heart's content, but found herself overtaken by the need to be filled up again and entrusted the business to a physician where she was. A nice, amusing young man. But what was the result? Here she was overtaken by a perfect paroxysm of laughter. He had filled her too full. There were no other words to describe it. That said it all. He had meant too well by her. He had probably not too well understood the technique. The long and short of it was, in that condition, not able to breathe, suffering from cardiac depression, she had come back, ha, ha, and Behrens, cursing and storming with a vengeance, had stuck her into bed. For now she was ill indeed, not actually in high fever but finished done made a mess of. Oh, what a face he was making, how funny he looked, ha ha ha. She pointed at Hans Castorp and laughed so hard that even her brow grew blue. The funniest thing of all, she said, was the way Behrens raved and reviled. It had made her laugh, at first, when she discovered that she was overfilled. You are in absolute danger of your life, he had bellowed at her, just like that, without making any bones of it. What a bear. Ah, ha ha ha. You really must please forgive me. It remained unclear what aspect of Behrens's outburst had made her laugh, whether his brusqueness, and because she did not believe what he said, or whether she did believe it, as indeed she must, it would seem, and quite simply found the fact of her imminent danger too funny for words. Hans Castorp got the impression that it was the latter, and that she was pealing, trilling, and cascading with laughter only out of childish irresponsibility and the incomprehension of her bird-like brain. He disapproved. He sent her some flowers, but never again beheld the laughter-loving lady, who, indeed, after she had sustained life upon oxygen for some days, expired in the arms of her hurriedly summoned husband. As big a goose as they make them, the Hofrat called her, in telling Hans Castorp of her death. But the young man had by then made further connections among the serious cases, thanks to the Hofrat and the house nurses, and Joachim had to accompany him on the visits he made, for instance to the son of Tulescu, the second, for the room of the first had long since been swept and garnished and fumigated with H2CO. They paid visits as well to Teddy, a boy who had lately been sent up from the Friedrichianum, as the school below was called, because his case proved too severe for the life there, to Anton Farlowich Furge, the Russo-German insurance agent, a good-natured martyr, and to that unhappy and yet so coquettish creature, Frau von Mallinckrodt. She, like all the foregoing, received flowers, and was even fed more than once from the hands of Hans Castorp, in the presence of Joachim. They gradually acquired the name of Good Samaritans and Brothers of Charity. Settembrini thus referred to their activities one day to Hans Castorp. Sapperlot, engineer, what is this I am hearing of your activities? So you have thrown yourself into a career of benevolence? You are seeking justification through good works. Nothing worth mentioning, Herr Settembrini. Nothing to make a fuss about. My cousin and I. Don't talk to me about your cousin. When the two of you make yourselves talked about, it is you we are dealing with. Your cousin's is a good and simple nature, most worthy of respect, exposed to no intellectual perils, the sort that gives a schoolmaster not one anxious moment. You'll not make me believe he is the moving spirit. No, yours is the more gifted if also the more exposed nature. You are, if I may so express myself, life's delicate child. One has to trouble about you. And, moreover, you have given me permission to trouble about you. Certainly, Herr Settembrini. Once and for all. Very kind of you. Life's delicate child. Why, that's very pretty. Only an author would think of it. I don't know if I've to flatter myself over the title, but I like the sound of it at least, I must say that. Yes, I do occupy myself rather with the children of death, if that is what you refer to. I look in here, and they're among the serious cases, and the dying when I have time. The service of the cure doesn't suffer from it. I visit the ones who aren't here for the fun of the thing, leading a disorderly life, the ones who are busy dying. And yet it is written, "Let the dead bury their dead," said the Italian. Hans Castorp raised his arms, to signify that there was so much written on both sides, it was hard to know the rights of it. Of course, the organ grinder had voiced a disturbing point of view. That was to be expected. Hans Castorp was ready, now as ever, of his own free will to lend an ear to Settembrini's teachings, and by way of experiment to be influenced by them. But he was far from being prepared to give up, for the sake of a pedagogic point of view, enterprises which he vaguely, despite Mother Jerngross and her phrases, despite the uninspiring young Rotbian and the cachinnations of the overfilled, found somehow helpful and significant. Tulestua's son was named Loro. He too received flowers, earthy, heavenly-smelling violets from two sympathetic housemates, with best wishes for recovery. And as this anonymity had by now become purely formal, since everyone knew the source whence such attentions came, Tulestu herself thanked the cousins when they chanced to meet in the corridor. The pale, dark Mexican mother begged them, with a few incoherent words and chiefly by means of a pathetic gesture of invitation, to come and receive in person the thanks of her son. Son sol et dernier fils, coalit murer ossi. They went at once. Loro proved to be an astonishingly handsome young man, with great glowing eyes, a nose like an eagle's beak, quivering nostrils, and beautiful lips, with a small black mustache sprouting above them. But his bearing was so theatrical and swaggering that Hans Castorp, this time no less than Joachim Ziemßen, was glad when they closed the invalid's door behind them. Tulestu had ranged forlornly up and down the room, with her long, bent-kneed stride, in her black cashmere shawl, with the black scarf knotted beneath her chin, her forehead crossed with wrinkles, great pouches of skin under the jet-black eyes, and one corner of her large mouth pathetically drooping. Sometimes she approached them as they sat by the bed, to reiterate her parrot-like speech. Tu leste, vous comprenez, messis, premièrement Ellen et maintenant l'autre. And the handsome Loro deliver himself of rolling, ranting, intolerably bombastic phrases, also in French, to the effect that he knew how a hero should die and meant to do it. Comme heroes à l'Espagnol, like his young brother, de même quo son fier jeune frère Fernando, who likewise had died like a Spanish hero. He gesticulated, he tore open his shirt to offer his yellow breast to the stroke of fate, and continued thus until an attack of coughing, which forced a thread of red foam to his lips, quenched his harangue and gave the cousins an excuse to go out on tiptoe. They did not mention the visit to Loro's bedside. Even to themselves they refrained from comment on his behavior. But both were better pleased with their call upon Anton Karlovich Ferge from St. Petersburg, who lay in bed, with his great good-natured beard and his just as good-natured-looking great Adam's apple, recovering slowly from the unsuccessful attempt which had been made to install the pneumothorax in his interior economy, and which had been within a hair's breadth of costing Ferge's life on the spot. He had suffered a frightful shock, the pleuroshock, a quite frequent occurrence in cases where this fashionable technique was applied. But Ferge's shock had been exceptionally dangerous, a total collapse and critical loss of consciousness, in a word so severe an attack that the operation had been broken off at once and was indefinitely postponed. Ferge's good-natured gray eyes grew large and round. His face went ashen-colored when he came to speak of the operation, which must have been horrible indeed. No anesthesia, my dear sir. In this case it doesn't do. A sensible man understands that and accepts the situation as it is. But the local doesn't reach very far down. It only benumbs the surface flesh. You feel it when they lay you open, like a pinching and squeezing. I lie there with my face covered, so I can't see anything. The assistant holds me on one side and the directress on the other. I feel myself being pinched and squeezed. That is the flesh they are laying back and pegging down. Then I hear the Hofrat say, "Very good." And then he begins with a blunt instrument. It must be blunt, not to pierce through too soon, to go over the pleura and find the place where he can make an incision and let the gas in, and when he begins moving about over my pleura with his instrument. Oh Lord, oh Lord. I felt it was all up with me. It was something perfectly indescribable. The pleura, my friends, is not anything that should be felt of. It does not want to be felt of, and it ought not to be. It is taboo. It is covered up with flesh and put away once and for all. Nobody and nothing ought to come near it. And now he uncovers it and feels all over it. My God, I was sick in my stomach. Horrible, awful. Never in my life have I imagined there could be such a sickening feeling outside hell and its torments. I fainted. I had 3 fainting fits, one after the other, a green, a brown, and a violet. And there was a stink. The shock went to my sense of smell, and I got an awful stench of hydrogen sulfide, the way it must smell in the bad place. With all that, I heard myself laughing as I went off. Not the way a human being laughs. It was the most indecent, ghastly kind of laughing I ever heard. Because when they go over your pleura like that, I tell you what it is as though you were being tickled, horribly, disgustingly tickled. That is just what the infernal torment of the pleurashock is like, and may God keep you from it. Often, and never without blanching and shuddering, did Anton Karlovich Verge come back to this infernal experience of his and torture himself with it in retrospect. He had from the first professed himself a simple man. The higher things of this life, he said, were utterly beyond him. He expressly stipulated that no intellectual or emotional demands be made upon him. He, for his part, made none upon anybody else. This bargain once struck, he turned out to talk not unentertainingly of his experiences in the life from which his illness had withdrawn him. He had been in the employ of a fire insurance company and made constant extended journeys from St. Petersburg up and down the whole of Russia, visiting insured factory buildings and spying out those which were financially suspect, for it was a fact supported by statistics that the larger percentage of fires occurred in just those factories where business was not going too well. Thus he was sent out to study a plant, under this or that pretext, and render an account to his company, so that serious loss could be provided against betimes, by increased counterinsurance or dividing the risk. He told of winter journeys through the length and breadth of Russia, of night travel in extreme cold, in sledges that you lay down in, under sheepskin covers, and when you roused you could see the eyes of wolves gleaming like stars across the snow. He carried his provisions frozen, cabbage soup and white bread, in boxes. When they stopped to change horses at a station, these could be thawed out, as required, and the bread would be as fresh as on the day it was baked. But when there came a sudden mild spell, he would find that the soup he had brought with him in chunks had melted and run away. Thus Haferge, now and then interrupting his narrative with a sigh, and the remark that it was all very well, if only they did not try the pneumothorax again. His talk was devoid of the higher things, but it was full of facts, and interesting to listen to, particularly for Hans Castorp, who found it profited him to hear about Russia and life as it was lived there, about samovars and pirogues, Cossacks, and wooden churches with so many towers shaped like onion tops as to look like a whole colony of mushrooms. He led Haferge to talk about the people, the strange and exotic northern types, with their Asiatic tincture, the prominent cheekbones and Finnish Mongolian slant to the eye, listening with anthropological interest to all that he heard. At his request, Haferge spoke Russian to him. The outlandish, spineless, washed-out idiom came pouring from under the good-natured mustaches, out of the good-natured Adam's apple, and Hans Castorp enjoyed it the more, youth-like, because all this was, pedagogically considered, forbidden fruit he was tasting. He and Joachim spent many a quarter hour with Anton Karlovich. Also they visited the lad Teddy from the Fridericianum, a young exquisite of 14 years, blonde and elegant, with a private nurse, and arrayed in white silk-corded pajamas. He was rich, he told them, and an orphan. He was here awaiting the moment for a serious operation they intended to try, for the removal of certain infected parts. Now and again, when he had a good day, he would leave his bed and dress in his neat sports attire to mingle for an hour in the company below. The ladies liked to dally with him, and he listened to their talk, for example to that concerning Lawyer Einhoff, the young lady in the combinations, and Franchen Oberdank. Then he would return to his bed. thus idly and elegantly passed the time for the lad Teddy, and it was very plain that he expected nothing more from life than just this which he had. Then there was Frau Mallinckrodt in number 50, Natalie by name, with the black eyes and the gold rings in her ears, coquettish, fond of dress, but a perfect Lazarus and Job in female form, whom God had been pleased to afflict with every kind of infirmity. Her entire organism seemed infected, and she suffered from all possible complaints by turns and simultaneously. The skin was sympathetically involved, being covered in large tracts by an itching eczema, with open sores here and there, even on the mouth, which made feeding difficult. Then she suffered from internal inflammations of various kinds, of the pleura, the kidneys, the lungs, the periosteum, even of the brain, so that she was subject to loss of consciousness. Finally, cardiac weakness, the result of constant pain and fever, gave her the greatest distress and even made it, at times, impossible for her to swallow, so that a mouthful of food would remain stuck in her throat. The woman's state was truly pitiable, and she was alone in the world, for she had left home and children for the sake of a lover, a mere youth, only to be forsaken in her turn. All this she herself related to the cousins, and now was without a home, if not without means, since her husband saw that she should not want. She accepted with no false pride the fruits of his charity or his unquenched love, whichever it was, seeing herself quite humbly as a dishonored and sinful creature, and so bore all the plagues of Job with astounding patience and resilience, with the elementary powers of resistance of her sex, which triumphed over all the misery of her tawny body, and even made of the gauze dressings which she had to wear about her head a becoming personal adornment. She changed her jewels many times in the day, began with corals in the morning and ended at night with pearls. Hans Castorp's flowers greatly delighted her. She obviously regarded them as the expression of gallant rather than charitable sentiments, and invited both young men to tea in her room. She drank from an invalid cup, all her fingers decked to the joint with opals, amethysts, and emeralds. In no long time, she had told her guests her story, the golden earrings swaying as she talked. Told of her respectable, tiresome husband, her no less respectable and tiresome children, who were precisely like their father, and for whom she had not been able to feel great warmth of affection, of the half-boy, half-man with whom she had fled, whose poetic tenderness she never tired of describing. But his family had taken him away from her, by guile and force commingled, and perhaps he too had been revolted by her illness, which had then suddenly and violently broken out. Perhaps the gentlemen were revolted too, she asked coquettishly, and her inborn femininity triumphed even over the eczema that covered half her face. Hans Castorp felt only contempt for the revolted lover and expressed it by a shoulder shrug. The poetic youth's defection was as a spur to himself, and he began to take occasion to perform what services he could for the unhappy woman in the repeated visits he made to her room, services that required no nursing skill, as, for instance, feeding her the midday broth after his own meal, giving her to drink when the food stuck in her throat, helping her to change her position in bed. For to add to everything else, she had a wound from an operation, which made lying difficult. He practiced himself in these acts of benevolence, looking in on her on his way to the dining hall, or when returning from a walk, and telling Joachim to go on ahead. He would stop for a moment in number 50 to see after a case. He experienced a pleasing sense of expanding being, the fruit of his conviction that what he did was both useful in itself and possessed of a secret significance. There was also a malicious satisfaction he had in the blamelessly Christian stamp his activities bore. It was so clear that on no ground whatever, either the military or the humanistic and pedagogic, were they open to any serious reproach. It was some time after this that they took up Karen Karstedt, and both Hans Castorp and Joachim felt peculiarly drawn to her. She had been up here for years and was an outpatient of the Hofrat, who had commended her to the cousins' benevolence. She was entirely without private means and dependent upon unfeeling relatives. Once, in fact, they had taken her away, since she was sure to die in any case, and only at the Hofrat's intercession did they send her back. She lived in a modest pension in the village, a 19-year-old, undersized little person, with sleek, oily hair, and eyes forever timidly trying to hide a brilliance that accorded only too well with the hectic flush on her cheek. Her voice had the characteristic huskiness, but was sympathetic. She coughed almost constantly, and all her finger ends were plastered up, as they had running sores. The Hofrat, then, had appealed to the cousins in Karen's behalf. They were such kind-hearted chaps, and they made her their special ward, beginning with a gift of flowers, following on with a visit to the poor child upon her little balcony in the village, and continuing with various outings which the three took together to see a skating race or a bobsleigh competition. For the winter sport season was now at its height. There was a special week overcrowded with events, those feats and displays to which the cousins had previously paid only cursory attention. Joachim was averse from every kind of distraction up here. He was not here, he said, on their account. He was not here to enjoy life, and to put up with his sojourn in the measure in which it furnished him agreeable change and diversion. He was here solely and simply to get well as quickly as he could, in order to join the service below, real service, not the service of the cure, which was but a substitute, though to be sure he grudged any falling off in the duty he owed it. He was forbidden to join in the sports, to go and gape at them he did not like. As for Hans Castorp, he took too seriously, in too stern and inward a sense, his own share in the life of those up here to have a thought or a glance for the doings of people who made a sport station of the valley. But now his benevolent preoccupation with poor Fräulein Karstedt made some change in these views, and Joachim could hardly dissent without seeming unchristian. They fetched the patient at her humble lodging, in glorious, frosty sunny weather, and escorted her through the English Quarter, so named after the Hôtel d'Angleterre, and along the main street, lined with luxurious shops. Sleighs were jingling up and down. There were hosts of people, the idle rich and pleasure-loving from all over the world, who filled the Kurhaus and the other hotels of the place, all hatless, all clad in sports costumes which were the last word in elegance and beauty of fabric, all bronzed with winter sunburn and the glaring reflections from snowy slopes. All this world, including the cousins and their protégé, were betaking themselves to the rink, which lay in the depth of the valley not far from the Kurhaus. In summer it was a meadow, used for football. Music was playing, the Kurhaus band, stationed in the gallery of the wooden pavilion, above the four-cornered racecourse. Beyond all lay the mountains, in deep snow, against a dark blue sky. Our young people passed through the entrance, and the crowd that, seated in ascending tiers, surrounded the course on three sides. They found places for themselves, and sat down to look on. The professional skaters, in close-fitting costumes of black tricot with furred and braided jackets, cut figures, hovered and balanced, leaped and spun. A pair of virtuosi, male and female, professionals and hors concours, performed feats which they alone in all the world could perform, and evoked storms of applause and fanfares of trumpets. 6 young men of various nationalities competed for the speed prize, and labored 6 times round the four-sided course, bent over, with their hands behind their backs, some with handkerchiefs tied round their mouths. A bell rang in the midst of the music, and the crowd would burst out now and again with shouts of encouragement and applause. It was a gay company, in which the 3 invalids, the cousins and their protégé, sat and looked about them. There were white-teethed Englishmen in Scotch caps, talking in French to highly scented ladies dressed from head to foot in bright-colored woolens. Some of them even wore knickerbockers. Americans with small, neat heads, on which the hair was plastered down, pipe in mouth, and wearing shaggy furs the skin side out. Bearded, elegant Russians, looking barbarically rich, and Malayan Dutchmen, all these sitting among the German and Swiss population, as well as a sprinkling of indeterminate types, all speaking French, perhaps from the Balkans or the Levant. Hans Castorp showed certain weakness for this motley semi-barbarous world, but Joachim put it aside as mongrel and questionable. At intervals there were events for children, who staggered over the course with a snowshoe on one foot and a ski on the other. In one race each boy pushed a girl before him on a shovel. In another the winner carried a lighted taper and must arrive at the goal with it still burning, or must climb over obstacles in his path, or pick up potatoes with a tin spoon and deposit them in watering pots placed along the course. Everybody was in extravagant spirits. The richest children were pointed out, the prettiest and those from well-known families. There were the little daughter of a Dutch multimillionaire, the son of a Prussian prince, and a 12-year-old lad who bore the name of a champagne known the world over. Young Karen was gay with the rest and coughed persistently as she laughed, clapping for joy and very gratitude her poor hands with the running finger ends. The cousins took her to see the bobsleigh races as well. It was no distance to the terminus, either from Karen's lodging or from the Berghof, for the track came down from the Swiss Alps and ended in the village, among the houses on the western slope. At that point a hut had been erected, where word was received by telephone of the departures up above. Then the low sleds would come singly, with long intervals between, around the curves of the white course that shone metallic between frozen barriers of snow. The riders were men and women, in white woolens, with gay-colored scarves of all nationalities wound about them. They were all red and lusty, and it snowed into their faces as they came on. Sledges would skid and upset, rolling their riders into the snow, and the onlookers would take photographs of the scene. Here too music played. The spectators sat in small tribunes, or pressed upon the narrow path that had been shoveled alongside the course, or thronged the wooden bridges which spanned it, watching the sleds that from time to time whizzed beneath. This was the path taken by the corpses from the sanatorium above, Hans Castorp thought. Round these curves, under these bridges they came, down, to the valley below. He spoke of it to the others. They even took Karen, one afternoon, to the Bioscope Theater in the Platz. She loved it all so very much. The bad air they sat in was offensive to the three, used as they were to breathing the purest. It oppressed their breathing and made their heads feel heavy and dull. Life flitted across the screen before their smarting eyes. Life chopped into small sections, fleeting, accelerated, a restless, jerky fluctuation of appearing and disappearing, performed to a thin accompaniment of music, which set its actual tempo to the phantasmagoria of the past, and with the narrowest of means at its command, yet managed to evoke a whole gamut of pomp and solemnity, passion, abandon, and gurgling sensuality. It was a thrilling drama of love and death they saw silently reeled off. The scenes, laid at the court of an oriental despot, galloped past, full of gorgeousness and naked bodies, thirst of power, and raving religious self-abnegation, full of cruelty, appetite, and deathly lust, and slowing down to give a full view of the muscular development of the executioner's arms. Constructed, in short, to cater to the innermost desires of an onlooking international civilization. Settembrini, as critic, Hans Castorp thought, and whispered as much to his cousin, would doubtless have sharply characterized what they saw as repugnant to a humanistic sense, and have scarified with direct and classic irony the prostitution of technical skill to such a humanly contemptible performance. On the other hand, Frau Stohr, who was sitting not far from our three friends, seemed utterly absorbed. Her ignorant red face was twisted into an expression of the hugest enjoyment. And so were the other faces about them. But when the last flicker of the last picture in a reel had faded away, when the lights in the auditorium went up, and the field of vision stood revealed as an empty sheet of canvas, there was not even applause. Nobody was there to be applauded, to be called before the curtain and thanked for the rendition. The actors who had assembled to present the scenes they had just enjoyed were scattered to the winds. Only their shadows had been here. Their activity had been split up into millions of pictures, each with the shortest possible period of focus, in order to give it back to the present and reel it off again at will. The silence of the crowd, as the illusion passed, had about it something nerveless and repellent. Their hands lay powerless in face of the nothing that confronted them. They rubbed their eyes, stared vacantly before them, blinking in the brilliant light and wishing themselves back in the darkness, looking at sights which had had their day and then, as it were, had been transplanted into fresh time and bedizened up with music. The despot died beneath the knife, with a soundless shriek. Then came scenes from all parts of the world. The President of the French Republic, in top hat and cordon, sitting in a landau and replying to a speech of welcome, the Viceroy of India at the wedding of a Raja, the German Crown Prince in the courtyard of a Potsdam garrison. There was a picture of life in a New Mecklenburg village, a cockfight in Borneo, naked savages blowing on nose horns, a wild elephant hunt, a ceremony at the court of the king of Siam, a courtesan street in Japan, with geishas sitting behind wooden lattices, Samieads bundled in furs, driving sledges drawn by reindeer through the snowy wastes of Siberia, Russian pilgrims praying at Hebron, a Persian criminal under the knout. They were present at all these scenes. Space was annihilated, the clock put back, the then and there played on by music and transformed into a juggling, scurrying now and here. A young Moroccan woman, in a costume of striped silk, with trappings in the shape of chains, bracelets, and rings, her swelling breasts half bared, was suddenly brought so close to the camera as to be life-sized. One could see the dilated nostrils, the eyes full of animal life, the features in play as she showed her white teeth in a laugh, and held one of her hands, with its blanched nails, for a shade to her eyes, while with the other she waved to the audience, who stared, taken aback, into the face of the charming apparition. It seemed to see and saw not. It was not moved by the glances bent upon it. Its smile and nod were not of the present but of the past, so that the impulse to respond was baffled, and lost in a feeling of impotence. Then the phantom vanished. The screen glared white and empty, with the one word "finest" written across it. The entertainment was over. In silence the theater was emptied. A new audience took the place of that going out, and before their eager eyes the cycle would presently unroll itself again. Incited by Frau Storr, who joined them at the exit, they paid a visit to the café at the courthouse, Karen clapping her hands in delighted gratitude. Here, too, there was music, a small, red-uniformed orchestra, conducted by a Bohemian or Hungarian first violin, who stood apart from the others, among the dancing couples, and belabored his instrument with frantic wreathings of his body. Life here was mundane. Strange drinks were handed at the tables. The cousins ordered orangeade for the refreshment of their charge and themselves, while Frau Storr took a brandy and sugar. The room was hot and dusty. At this hour, she said, the café life was not yet in full swing. The dancing became much livelier as the evening advanced, and numerous patients from the sanatoria, as well as dissipated folk from the hotels and the courthouse, many more than were here as yet, came later to join the fun. More than one serious case had here danced himself into eternity, tipping up the beaker of life to drain the last drop, and in dulce jubilo suffering his final hemorrhage. The dulce jubilo became, on her unlettered lips, something extraordinary. The first word she pronounced dolce, with some reminiscence of her musical husband's Italian vocabulary, but the second suggested jubilee, or an attempt to yodel, or goodness alone knew what. The cousins both devoted themselves assiduously to the straws in their glasses when this Latin was given out, but Frau Storr took no offense. She began, drawing back her lips and showing her rodent-like teeth, to drop hints and make insinuations on the subject of the relations of the three young people. As far as poor Karen was concerned, it was all pretty obvious, and as Frau Storr said, she could not but enjoy being chaperoned, on her little outings, by such fine cavaliers. But the other side was not so easy to come at. However, ignorance and stupidity notwithstanding, the creature's feminine intuition helped her to a glimpse, even though a partial and vulgarized one, of the truth. For she saw, and even teasingly aimed at the fact, that Hans Castorp was the cavalier, and young Ziemsen merely in attendance. Further, for she was aware of the state of Hans Castorp's feeling toward Madame Chowchat, that he was playing the gallant to poor little Karstedt because he did not know how to approach the other. It was a simple guess, lacking profundity and not actually covering all the facts of the case. In short, it was only too worthy of Frau Storr, and when she came out with it, flat-footed, he did not even answer, save by a faint smile and an impenetrable stare. So much was true, after all, that poor Karen did afford him a substitute, an intangible yet real support, as did the rest of his charitable activities. But at the same time they were an end in themselves too. The inward satisfaction he experienced whenever he fed the afflicted Frau Mallinckrodt her broth, or suffered her Ferge to tell him once more the tale of the infernal Pleurachok, or saw poor Karen clapping her ravaged and mortifying hands in grateful joy, was perhaps of a vicarious and relative kind, yet it was none the less pure and immediate. It was rooted in a tradition diametrically opposed to the one her Settembrini, as pedagogue, represented, yet seemed to him, young Hans Castorp, for all that, not unworthy of having applied to it the place at Expiry. The little house where Karen Karstedt lived lay near the railway track and the watercourse, on the way to the Dorf, quite conveniently for the cousins to fetch her after breakfast for the morning walk. Going thence toward the village, to arrive upon the main street, one had before one the little Skyhorn, and on its right 3 peaks which were called the Green Towers, but were now covered like the rest with snow that gleamed blindingly in the sun. Still further to the right came the round summit of the Dorfberg, and a quarter of the way up its slope was visible the cemetery of the Dorf, surrounded by a wall, obviously commanding a fine view, very likely of the distant lake, and thus suggesting itself naturally as the goal of a promenade. Thither they went, one lovely morning. Indeed, all the days now were lovely, with a hot sun, a sparkling frost, a deep blue, windless air, and a scene that glittered whitely all abroad. The cousins, one of them brick-red in the face, the other bronzed, walked without overcoats, which would have been intolerable in this sunshine. Young Ziemsen in sports clothes, with arctics, Hans Castorp in arctics as well, but with long trousers, not feeling worldly enough to don short ones. This was the new year, between the beginning and middle of February. Yes, the last figure in the date had changed since Hans Castorp came up here. It was written now with the next higher digit. The minute hand on Time's clock had moved one space further on. Not one of the large spaces, not one which measured the centuries or the decades. It was only the year that had been shoved forward by one figure. Though Hans Castorp had been up here not a whole year yet, but scarcely more than half a one, it had jerked itself on, as does the minute hand of certain large clocks, which only register by 5 minutes at a time, and was now pointing motionless, awaiting the moment to move forward. Again. But the hand that marked the months would have to move on for 10 spaces more, only 2 more, in fact, than it had moved since he came up here, for February did not count, being once begun, as money changed counts as money spent. To the graveyard then, on the slope of the Dorfberg, the 3 wended their way. We tell it to complete the tale of their excursions. It was Hans Castorp's idea. Joachim probably had scruples at first, on the score of poor Karen, but in the end agreed that it was useless to pretend with her, or to carry out Frau Storr's cowardly policy of shielding her from all that could remind her of her end. Karen Karstedt was not yet so far on as to display the self-deception that marks the last stage. She knew quite well how it stood with her, and what the necrosis of her fingertips meant, knew too that her unfeeling relatives would not hear of the unnecessary expense of having her sent back home, and that it would be her lot, after her exit, to fill a modest space up yonder. In short, it might even be said that such an excursion was more fitting, morally spoken, than many another, than the cinematograph or the bobsleigh races, for example, and surely it was no more than proper to make those lying up their visit once in a way, as a comradely attention, provided one did not regard it as in the same class with an ordinary walk or excursion to a point of interest. Slowly they went, in single file, up the narrow path that had been made in the snow, leaving the highest villas behind and below them, and watching the familiar scene unroll in its winter splendor, a little altered in perspective, and opening out to the northwest, toward the entrance of the valley. There was the hoped-for view of the lake, now a frozen and snow-covered round, bordered with trees. The mountains seemed to slope directly down to its farther shore, while beyond these again showed unfamiliar peaks, all in full snow, overtopping each other against the blue sky. The young folk looked at the view, standing in the snow before the stone gateway to the cemetery. Then they entered through the ironwork grille, which was on the latch. Here too they found paths shoveled between the small enclosures, each of which was surrounded with its railing, each containing a number of graves. The snow rounded over and built up each smooth and even elevation, with its cross of stone or metal, its small monument adorned with medallions and inscriptions. No soul was to be seen or heard. The quiet remoteness and peace of the spot seemed deep and unbroken in more than one sense. A little stone angel or Cupid, finger on lip, a cap of snow askew on its head, stood among the bushes, and might have passed for the genius of the place, the genius of a silence so definite that it was less a negation than a refutation of speech. The silence it guarded was far from being empty of content or character. Here it would have been in place for our two male visitors to take off their hats, had they had any on. But they were, even Hans Castorp, bareheaded, and could only walk reverently, their weight on the balls of their feet, making instinctive inclinations on one side and the other, single file in the wake of Karen Karstedt, as she led the way. The cemetery was irregular in shape, having begun as a narrow rectangle facing the south, and then thrown out other rectangles on both sides. Successive increases in size had evidently been necessary, and plowed land had been taken in. Even so, the present enclosure seemed fairly full, both along the wall and in the less desirable inner plots. One could hardly see or say just where another interment was to take place. The three wandered for some time discreetly along the paths, among the enclosures, stopping to decipher a name or date here or there. The tablets and crosses were modest affairs that must have cost but little. The inscriptions bore names from every quarter of the earth. They were in English or Russian or other Slavic tongues, also German, Portuguese, and more. The dates told their own sad story, for the time they covered was generally a short span indeed, the age between birth and death averaging not much more than 20 years. Not crabbed age, but youth peopled the spot. Folk not yet settled in life, who from all corners of the earth had come together here to take up the horizontal for good and all. Somewhere in the thick of the graves, near the heart of the acre, lay a small, flat, leveled place, the length of a man, between two rounded mounds with wreaths of everlasting hanging on their headstones. Involuntarily the three paused here, the young girl first, to read the mournful inscriptions. Hans Castorp stood relaxed, his hands clasped before him, his eyes veiled and his mouth somewhat open, young Ziemßen very self-controlled, and not only erect, but even bending a thought backward, and both the cousins stole a glance at Karen's face. She stood there, aware of their glance, with modest and shamefaced mien, her head bent on her shoulder, blinking her eyes and smiling a strained little smile. Walpurgis night. Within the next few days it would be 7 months since Hans Castorp's advent among those up here, while cousin Joachim, who had already had 5 to his credit, would soon be able to look back upon 12, that is to say, upon a whole round year. Round, indeed, in a cosmic sense, for since the dowdy little locomotive had set him down at these heights, the earth had completed one full course round the sun, and was returned to the point whence it had been set out. The carnival season was at hand, and Hans Castorp inquired among the old inhabitants of the Berghof what it would be like. Magnifique, answered Settembrini, whom the cousins had again encountered on the morning walk. Gorgeous, he said. Every bit as lively as it is in the Prater. You shall see, engineer, the gayest gallants of the night, in brilliant rows advancing, he quoted, and went on in his most mocking vein, couching his jibes in sounding phrases, with a telling accompaniment of arm, shoulder, and head movements. What do you expect? Even in Maisons de Santé they have their balls for the fools and idiots, I've read. Why not up here as well? The program includes various danses macabres, as you may imagine, but unfortunately some of last year's guests will not be here, the party being over at 9:30, you perceive. Do you mean— Oh, capital, laughed Hans Castorp. Herr Settembrini, you are a wretch. 9:30, I say, did you get that? He turned to his cousin. Herr Settembrini means it would be too early for some of last year's guests to take part. Ha, spooky. He means the ones that have taken leave of the flesh and the things of the flesh in the meantime. But I am all excitement, he said. I think it's quite proper to celebrate the feasts up here as they come, and mark off the time in the usual way. Just a dead level of monotony, without any breaks at all, would be too awful for words. We have had Christmas already, we took notice of the beginning of the new year, and now comes Shrove Tuesday, after that, Palm Sunday, Holy Week, Easter, then 6 weeks after that, Whit Sunday, then it is almost midsummer, the solstice, and we begin to go toward autumn. Stop, 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 Settembrini cried, lifting his face to heaven and pressing his temples with the palms of his hands. Be quiet, I cannot listen to you letting go the reins like that. Pardon me, I mean it just the other way. Behrens will finally have to make up his mind to the injections to get rid of my infection. My temperature sticks at 99.3 degrees to 4, 5, 6, and even 7. I am, and I continue to be, life's delicate child. I don't mean I am a long-termer. Rhadamanthus hasn't let me in for any definite number of months, but he did say it would be nonsense to interrupt the cure when I've been up here so long already and invested so much time, so to speak. Even if he did set a term, what good would it do me? When he says, for instance, half a year that is to be taken as the minimum, it is always more. Look at my cousin. He was to have finished the beginning of the month, finished in the sense of being healed, cured, and the last time Behrens saw him, he stuck on 4 more to make sure he is entirely sound. Well, then where are we? Why, at the summer solstice, just as I said, without the faintest notion of offending you, and on the way to winter. Well, for the present what we have before us is fashion, and as I say, I consider it fit and proper to celebrate it in the usual way, just as it comes in the calendar. Frau Storr tells me the concierge sells tin horns at his lodge. Did you know that? And so it fell out. Shrove Tuesday came on apace. Before one had actually seen it on the way, it arrived. All sorts of absurd instruments were snarling and squealing in the dining hall, even at early breakfast. At midday, paper snakes were launched from the table where Ganser, Rasmussen, and Fräulein Kleefeld sat. Paper caps were mounted. They, like the trumpets, were to be had of the concierge. The round-eyed Marussia was among the first to appear in one. But in the evening, there were festivities in the hall and the reception rooms, in the course of which, but we alone know to what, thanks to Hans Castorp's enterprising spirit, these carnival gaieties led up in their course, and we do not mean to let our knowledge betray us into indiscretion. We shall pay time all the honor due it, and precipitate nothing. Nay, rather, we shall incline to protract the tale, out of feeling for young Hans Castorp's moral compunctions, which have so long prevented him from crossing his Rubicon. Everybody went down to the Platz in the afternoon to see the streets in carnival mood, with harlequins and columbines shaking their rattles, with maskers on foot and in jingling, decorated sleighs, among whom went forward lively skirmishes, and much confetti was flung. Spirits were very high at all 7 tables when the guests assembled for the evening meal. There was every indication that the fun begun abroad would continue in the same key within doors. The concierge had done a thriving trade in rattles and tin trumpets. Lawyer Parvant had been the first to go further in the same line, putting on a lady's kimono and a braid of false hair belonging to Frau Consul General Wurmbrand. He wore his mustaches drawn down on each side of his mouth with the tongs, and looked the very picture of a Chinaman, evoking loud applause from all quarters. The management had done its share. Each of the 7 tables was decked with a paper lantern, a colored moon with a lighted candle inside. When Settembrini entered, and passed by Hans Castorp's, he quoted. He brought out the words with his fine, dry smile, and sauntered to his place, where he was greeted with a rain of missiles like tiny pellets that broke and scattered a spray of perfume where they fell. Yes, from the first moment the key was high. The bursts of laughter were unintermitted. Paper snakes hung down from the chandeliers, swaying to and fro. Confetti swam in the sauces. Very early the dwarf waitress brought in the first ice pail, the first bottle of champagne. Inspired by Lawyer Einhoff, the guests drank it mixed with Burgundy. Toward the end of the meal the ceiling light went out, and only the colorful twilight of the paper lanterns illumined the room, making of the scene an Italian night, and setting the crown upon the mood of the evening. Settembrini passed over a paper to Hans Castorp's table, by the hand of Marussia, who sat nearest him, with a green tissue-paper jockey cap on her head. On it he had written with a pencil. This was received with enthusiasm, though Dr. Blumenkohl, whose state had now much altered for the worse, muttered something to himself, with the expression peculiar to him upon his face, or rather upon his lips. He seemed to be asking what sort of verses were these. But Hans Castorp considered that an answer was due. He felt it incumbent on him to cap the quotation, though it was unlikely he would have produced anything very striking. He searched his pockets for a pencil, but found none, nor could Joachim or the schoolmistress supply his need, and his bloodshot eyes looked to the east for aid, to the farther left-hand corner of the room, It was plain that his fleeting purpose was dissipated in a widening circle of associations. He paled a little and entirely lost sight of his original intention. Other good ground there was for paling. Frau Chowchat had made special toilet for carnival. She wore a new gown, or at least one new to our hero, of thin, dark silk, probably black, or, at most shot with a golden brown. It was cut with a modest little round neck like a schoolgirl's frock, hardly so much as to show the base of the throat, or the collarbones, or the slightly prominent bone at the back of the neck, beneath the soft fringes or her hair. But it left free to the shoulder Klavdia's arms, so tender and yet so full, so cool, so amazingly white, set off against the dark silk of her frock, with such ravishing effect that it made Hans Castorp close his eyes and murmur within himself, "Oh my God!" He had never seen such a mode before. Ball gowns he had seen, stately and ceremonial, cut in conformity with a fashion that exposed far more of the person than this one did, without achieving a jot of its sensational effect. Poor Hans Castorp. He was reminded of a theory he had once held about these arms, on making their acquaintance for the first time, veiled in diaphanous gauze, that it was the gauze itself, the illusion, as he called it, which had lent them their indescribable, unreasonable seductiveness. Folly, the utter, accentuated, blinding nudity of these arms, these splendid members of an infected organism, was an experience so intoxicating, compared with that earlier one, as to leave our young man no other recourse than again, with drooping head, to whisper, soundlessly, "Oh my God!" Later on, another paper was handed over, on which was written, "Bravo, bravo," they shouted. They were drinking coffee by now, served in little brown earthenware jugs, and some of them liqueurs as well, for instance Frau Storr, who adored the sweet and spirituous. The company began to rise from table, to move about, to pay visits. Part of the guests had already moved into the reception rooms, others remained seated, still faithful to the drink they had mingled. Settembrini, coffee cup in hand, sporting his toothpick, crossed over and sat down between Hans Castorp and the schoolmistress. "The Harz," he said, "near Skierk and Eland. Did I exaggerate, engineer? Here's a bedlam for you. But wait, the fun is not over so soon. Far from leaving off, it has not even reached its height. From what I hear, there will be more masquerading. Certain people have left the room. We are justified in anticipating almost anything." Even as he spoke, new maskers entered, women dressed as men, with beards and mustaches of burnt cork, betraying themselves by their figures and looking like characters in comic opera. Men in women's clothes, tripping over their skirts. Here was the student Rasmussen in a black jet-trimmed toilet, displaying a pimpled décolleté and fanning himself front and back with a paper fan. There was a Pierrot, costumed in white underwear, with a lady's felt hat, a powdered face that gave his eyes an unnatural expression, and lips garish with blood-red pomade, the youth with the fingernail. A Greek from the bad Russian table, who rejoiced in beautiful legs, strutted in tights, with short cloak, paper ruff, and dagger, personating a fairy prince, or a Spanish grandee. All these costumes had been improvised since the end of the meal. Frau Storr could sit still no longer. She too disappeared, and presently returned dressed as a charwoman, with skirt looped up and sleeves rolled back, a paper cap tied under her chin, armed with pail and brush. She began scrubbing about under the tables, among the feet of those still sitting. "See Beldam Bobo riding now," quoted Settembrini as she appeared, and gave the next line too, in his clear and plastic delivery. She heard it and retorted by calling him a turkey cock and bidding him keep his filthy jokes to himself. With the license of the season she addressed him, her Settembrini, with the thou. But indeed this familiarity had become quite general during the meal. He girded himself to reply, when a fresh stir and laughter in the hall interrupted him, and those in the dining-room looked up expectantly. Followed by a troop of guests, two singular figures entered. One was dressed like a nurse, but her black uniform was marked off from head to foot by short white strips close under each other, with a longer one at regular intervals, like degrees on a thermometer. She had one finger laid to her pallid lips, and in her other hand a fever chart. Her companion was all in blue, with blue paint on lips, brows, throat, cheeks, and chin, and a blue woolen cap, right over one ear. He was dressed in a pullover of glazed blue linen, tied round the ankles, and stuffed out into a great paunch round the middle. These were Frau Iltis and her Albin. They wore cardboard placards, on which were written the Silent Sister and the Blue Peter. Together, with sidling gait, they moved through the room. What applause there was! What ringing shouts! Frau Storr, her broom under her arm and her hands on her knees, laughed like the charwoman she impersonated. Only Settembrini was unmoved. He cast one glance at the successful maskers, and his lips became a fine thin line beneath the waving mustaches. Among the troops streaming in the rear of the blue and silent ones came Klavdia Chowchat, together with the woolly-haired Tamara and the man with the hollow chest named Bieligin, who was dressed in evening clothes. Klavdia brushed Hans Castorp's table with the folds of her new gown and crossed the room to where young Ganser and the Kleefeld were sitting. Her companions followed the rout out of the dining hall after the two allegorical maskers, but she stood there, her hands behind her back, laughing and chatting, her eyes like narrow slits. She too had mounted a cap. It was not a bought one, but the kind one makes for children, a simple cocked hat of white paper, set rakishly on her head, and suiting her, of course, to a marvel. Her feet showed beneath the dark golden-brown silk of her frock, whose skirt was somewhat draped. Of her arms we shall say no more in this place. They were bare to the shoulder. Look at her well, Hans Castorp heard his Settembrini say, as though from a distance, following her with his glance as she presently left the room. The fair one, see. 'Tis Lilith. Who? Asked Hans Castorp. Her Settembrini's literary soul was pleased. He answered. Adam's first wife is she. Besides themselves there was only Dr. Blumenkohl at the table, sitting in his place at the other end. Everyone else, even Joachim, was now in the drawing rooms. Hans Castorp said, and he too addressed his companion with the license of the season, and said thou to him. Dear me, you're full of poetry tonight. What lily do you mean? Did Adam marry more than once? I didn't know it. According to the Hebraic mythos, Lilith became a night-tripping fairy, a beldame sans merci, dangerous to young men especially, on account of her beautiful tresses. What the deuce? A hobgoblin with beautiful tresses. You couldn't stand that, could you? You would come along and turn on the electric light and bring the young men back to the path of virtue. That's what you do, isn't it? Hans Castorp said whimsically. He had drunk rather freely of the mixed burgundy and champagne. Hark ye, engineer, and take heed what I say, Settembrini answered frowning. You will kindly address me with the accepted form employed in the educated countries of the West, the third person pluralis, if I may make bold to suggest it.
Why?
Isn't this carnival? The other is the accepted form everywhere tonight. Yes, it is, and its charm lies in its very abandon. When strangers, who would regularly use the third person, speak to each other in the second, it is an objectionable freedom. It is wantonly playing with the roots of things, and I despise and condemn it, because at the bottom the usage is audaciously and shamelessly leveled against our civilization and our enlightened humanity. Do not, for one moment, imagine I addressed you with this form just now. I was quoting from the masterpiece of your national literature. I used poetic license. So did I. I am using a sort of poetic license now because it seems to me to suit the occasion, and that is why I do it. I don't say I find it perfectly natural and easy to say thou to you. On the contrary, it costs me an effort. I have to poke myself up to it. But I do so freely, gladly, and with all my heart. With all your... Yes, quite sincerely, with all my heart. We have been up here for some time together. Do you realize it is 7 months? That is not much, perhaps, as they reckon time here, but in the ordinary way it is a good deal, after all. Well, we have spent it with each other, because life brought us together. We have met almost daily, and had interesting conversations, in part upon subjects of which, down below, I should not have had the faintest understanding. But up here they seem to me very real and pertinent, and I was always very keen in our discussions, or rather, when you explained things to me as a homo humanus, for of course I was too inexperienced to contribute anything, and could only feel that all you said was highly worth listening to. It is through you I have learned to understand such a lot. That about Carducci was the least part of it. Take the Republic and the bellows style, and how they hang together, or time with human progress, and how if there was no time there could be no human progress, and the world would be only a standing drain and stagnant puddle. What should I have known of all that if it weren't for you? So I simply address you as though we were old and close friends, without further ceremony, and you must excuse me, because I don't know any other way. You sit there and I speak to you like this, and it is all that's necessary. For you are not, to me, just any man with a name like another. You are a representative, her Settembrini, an ambassador to this place and to me. Yes, that is what you are, Hans Castorp asserted, and struck the table with the flat of his hand. So now I will thank you, he went on, and shoved his champagne and burgundy along the table toward his Settembrini's coffee cup, as though to touch glasses with him. I thank you for having taken trouble for me in these 7 months, for having lent a hand to a young donkey in all the new experiences that came to him, and tried to influence him for his good, signed Pecunia, of course, partly by means of anecdote and partly in abstractions. I distinctly feel the moment has come to thank you for all you have done, and to beg your pardon for being a troublesome pupil, a difficult, no, a delicate child of life. That was what you called me. It touched me very much to have you say that, and I feel touched every time I think of it. The troublesome child that I have been for you in your capacity as pedagogue. You remember, you came to speak of that on the first day we met. It is one of the associations you have taught me, the relation between humanism and pedagogy, and there are many others I shall think of as time goes on. You must forgive me, then, and not think too hardly of me. I drink your health, Settembrini. I drink to those literary endeavors of yours for the elimination of human suffering. He ceased speaking, bent over and drained his glass, hiccuped twice, and stood up. Now, let us join the others.